Hello, 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 hello. How are you? How is everyone doing today? Glad to be with you. It is a lovely day here in coronavirus epicenter, New York City. Outside my window, it's a little bit rainy, a little bit shiny. I actually had run low on orange juice, so I was forced to step outside. I made a mask out of my scarf from the wintertime, and I put on my coat, and I walked 2 blocks north into a convenience store, got some orange juice and other food items I needed. But I've been trying not to go outside. About, I think it was about a week and a half ago, I went to the store, the supermarket with my wife. We stockpiled, but we're trying to stay indoors while all of this is going on. But I know folks have a lot of things they want to talk about today. I have plenty that I want to talk about. A lot of action on the channel lately. The numbers are way up, and I'm glad to hear it. Many people are really excited to hear what we have to say here. Our message is really hitting home as the country enters a crisis. I have been saying for the past 2.5 years, longer than that, that we need a government of action to fight for working families. And amid this current crisis, that is becoming abundantly clear. We need a government of action that will fight for working families. And on that note, folks, I want to say that Donald Trump is a weakling. I've said that before. I said that after he killed Qasem Soleimani, and it's especially true right now. Folks, don't call Donald Trump a fascist. When you call Donald Trump a fascist, you're doing him a really big favor. A lot of Trump's base wants a strong man in the White House. They want a big, powerful leader that will work for them, that will fight for them, that will beat down their opponents, that'll make America great again. They want that. So if you call Trump a fascist, a lot of Trump's supporters kind of like the idea of a fascist. Donald Trump's definitely not a fascist. Donald Trump's a weakling. And we're seeing this over and over again. We saw that when he basically had to risk starting World War III, kill the top Iranian general just to avoid being impeached, just to make sure he had the backing of the Likud party in Israel before the impeachment vote went down. You'll notice Mitt Romney still voted against him, representing the Mormon axis. You'll also notice, furthermore, that now Donald Trump can't even tell his own supporters to stay home. He can't even tell his own supporters to stay home. Right? I mean, it's pretty unbelievable. He's the president of the United States. He's supposed to be managing the pandemic relief. But he is so afraid of pissing off his supporters that his supporters are doing wacky, stupid things that he knows is not good for public health. He doesn't agree with, but he is afraid of pouring cold water on his base. So we see his supporters out in Michigan and other places having public gatherings in defiance of the pandemic rules that you can't have gatherings of public people, you can't have big crowds of people. They're assembling, and they're chanting, "We want to work." And they're protesting against the pandemic with their guns, with their flags, with big crowds. And Donald Trump, who is on TV every day telling us to stay home, cannot even bring himself to say to his supporters, "Hey guys, I appreciate the support, but go home." He can't bring himself to say that. He is too afraid of losing the support of the people that are out there. He's too afraid of having his base feel betrayed that he literally cannot do what a president, any responsible president should do in this time. He is terrified. Trump has these little constituencies that support him. He has the Likud party faction in Israel, Sheldon Adelson. He's got the Gusano folks in Miami, the Miami Cubans. He's got the fracking companies. He's got Bernie Marcus, the owner of Home Depot. He's got Betsy DeVos and the DeVos Foundation and Blackwater. Eric Prince is Betsy DeVos's brother. And Amway, right, and whatever they're called now, that's Betsy DeVos's money as well. It's also Blackwater military contractors. And Trump has got these little pockets of supporters who don't agree with each other on a lot, are very divided, have different agendas. And Trump is desperately trying to please all of them. And the country is in a national pandemic, international pandemic, really. And he can't even bring himself to say to his own supporters, hey, guys, I appreciate the sentiment, but don't do it. Right? He can't make up his mind. 1 minute, he's a big supporter of Dr. Fauci. Another minute, oh, he's backing his supporters and criticizing him. He's afraid. He's afraid of losing anybody in his coalition. Donald Trump is not the dominant partner in the relationship. Donald Trump sits down with fracking companies. He sits down with Gusanos. He sits down with big oil, or not big oil, little oil, the frackers. He sits down with Blackwater military contracting corporations, and he says, guys, what do I have to do to get your support? He looks tough on TV. He puts on a good show. He's a reality TV star, but he doesn't really have strength. Donald Trump doesn't have strength. Donald Trump does not have strength. If Donald Trump was a fascist, he would have seized the moment, right? We know that after the Reichstag fire, when the Reichstag was burned, what happened? Well, Adolf Hitler then immediately declared an emergency, rounded up the communists and socialists, declared, set up a fascist state, assumed all this power. If Trump was a fascist and something like this happened, he would immediately rush in and push a very, very hard agenda and centralize power around himself. But Donald Trump can't do that because Donald Trump's a weakling. Donald Trump is a coward. Donald Trump is over-socialized. He wants the approval of others. I've heard stories about how in the 1980s, Donald Trump would be desperate to get his name in the papers. So he would call newspapers and talk in different voices to try and get them to cover him. Hey, did you hear what Trump just did? He desperately wants the approval of other people. He wants a crowd of supporters. He wants to be known. He wants to be popular. And that's all there is to it. He is a weak leader. He is a weak person. He longs for the affection of other people. He's pretty cowardly. He's a bit of a narcissist. But part of that is his appeal. People like a narcissist. People like somebody who doesn't apologize for themselves, who looks like very confident. People are very attracted to confidence. And right now, if Trump were indeed the strong man his supporters want him to be, that he would like you to believe he is, he would have taken action. He's incapable of taking action. He contradicts himself all the time. He can't tell his supporters to stay home. Donald Trump is a weakling. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that I think Biden will be better, and I'm going to talk about that later. We're going to talk about Joe Biden. There's a lot of voices out there saying, you got to just support Joe Biden to defeat Trump, everything to defeat Trump. I don't endorse any candidate, first of all. But I think that those people that are saying that are a bit naive, and there's a lot of things about Biden that I think people are unaware of, that people are ignoring in the name of kind of this panic. But there are some things about Biden that might be better than Trump. It's complicated. We're going to get into that later in the live. But the main thing to remember is those of you that are familiar with this channel and the programming here, we've been talking about a division within the ruling class, how there is a division in the ruling class. The biggest capitalists, the richest of the rich, the Silicon Valley giants, the super major oil companies, and the intelligence agencies represent a faction that you can call the Eastern establishment, the liberal wing of American politics that wants stability more than anything. They're already the top of the mountain. They're already the top of the heap. They don't want to shake things up. They want stability, right? The Rockefellers supported Roosevelt when he implemented a lot of reforms. The factory owners were the ones who were hurt by the unionization, by Social Security, all of that. But the Rockefellers thought, hey, if Roosevelt can stabilize things and we don't have protests and riots in the streets, and, we can have that. And that's, you talk about the Rockefeller faction, the Ford Foundation, you can go down the line. This faction that is in with the four super major oil companies, ExxonMobil, BP, Chevron, and Shell Oil, the Silicon Valley. Okay. I'm just seeing a super chat. I love super chats, by the way. I'm writing it down, and I will get to that. But hey, You know, these folks who they you know, they want stability. They're at the top of the heap. They have organized an apparatus of intellectuals, think tanks, and academics to back up their agenda. They want a stable United States, and they're open to more of a welfare state if that's necessary. They want to maximize their own profits. They want to work in the interests of Wall Street dominating the world, but they're not desperate to make profits in the short term because they're already at the top. So that's one faction. But Trump represents these lower levels of capital. The fracking companies, for example, that are in competition with the supermajor oil companies. Devon Energy, they call them the fracking cowboys. They hated Obama because that oil price under Obama went down lower and lower and lower. Right? Okay, super chats are just pouring in. I'm writing them down as I see them. But there's a division, and that these people out protesting right now saying, we want to work, they represent small business owners who are being killed. They're just being pummeled right now, small business owners. On top of that, who else is being pummeled by this? The fracking companies. These oil prices are driving them out of business. However, you'll notice, you'll notice that the stock of Amazon is the highest it has ever been. $1.1 trillion. Amazon is hiring people like crazy. It is expanding. Its profits are through the roof. And this is what happens. Right? If you read the writings of Thomas Jefferson writes about economics, and he's very, very naive. And he has it in his mind that America will be great because America will be a country of yeomen. This is Thomas Jefferson, And he writes, America will be great because it'll be a country of yeomen, small farmers who work on their own farm and have no employees, self-sustaining farmers. But what he doesn't get is that eventually there's going to be a problem. There's going to be a drought. There's going to be flooding. There's going to be a famine. And a bunch of farmers are going to go out of business. And the farmers who do better during that are then going to buy up their farms. And pretty soon you're going to have giant farms with people who used to be independent farmers working on them. That's what happens in a crisis, right? Some capitalists make out very, very well, and the rest go under, and capital centralizes, right? The means of production continue to centralize. Marx writes about this in Capital, how wealth and power in capitalist society continues to centralize in the hands of a few, right? This is the nature of capital, right? Companies compete, but some go out and some get bigger. The rule is expand or die becomes the rule of the market, and we're seeing that, right? The economy is crashing and burning right now. Massive unemployment, massive spending. Oil prices are low. I mean, it's a disaster. Jeff Bezos is doing better than he's ever done. He was already the world's richest man, according to somebody who added it up, and of course, that's naive, and I've talked about that. But regardless, on paper, Jeff Bezos was already the richest man in the world. Now he is far, far richer, by billions and billions and billions. This is a situation where we are seeing the centralization of capital, but the capital is centralizing in the hands of people like Bezos, people like Bill Gates. The 4 super major oil companies are watching their competitors fall and crash and burn in the fracking companies. And this is to the benefit of the faction that does not like Trump. And that those small business owners, those fracking companies are desperate right now. That's why you have people getting on TV and saying we should just let the old people die. So you have Dr. Phil, they're all going to die anyway. I think they should go back to work. Do people see that? New Cold War with China. All right, writing that down. All right, that's why these things are happening. That is why these things are happening. Amazon, Walmart, they're making out like bandits here. And the small business owners who back Trump, the lower levels of capital, are feeling the floodwaters rising, and they're becoming more and more and more desperate by the hour. They are getting more and more desperate. They are more and more afraid. Drawing negative attention. they're getting more and more afraid. And as a result of their growing fear and getting more and more afraid, as a result of that, they're getting more desperate, and Trump's coalition is coming apart. It's complicated. I'm not necessarily saying Biden is better. In some ways, Biden is worse than Trump. But, as someone's pointing out, Dr. Phil is not a medical doctor. He's not. But he was on Fox News, and the lieutenant governor of Texas was saying, just let folks die. Glenn Beck said what he said. This is all embarrassing, but it's because the lower levels of American capital, right? The United States has over 1 million millionaires in it. Well, most of those millionaires are not part of the club. They're not part of the Eastern establishment. They're not part of the elite, right? And they're feeling the pain right now, and they're fighting for their survival in the marketplace. And that's who the Tea Party generally was. They have a more libertarian outlook, right? They want the government hands off. They view the big capitalists as being tied in with government monopolies and being tied in with the government. They want a more free market approach because they resent those at the top. And this is a big divide between American capital. You read old pamphlets by the John Birch Society and the ultra-right wing of the 1950s. And they're always railing against communists, of course, but they start saying that Rockefeller is a communist and J.P. Morgan is a communist. These things are absurd. When by communists, they mean wealthy capitalists who are crushing small business owners, right? I believe the major funder of the John Birch Society was a guy who owned a small candy company that made flat suckers, right? I believe one of the big John Birch Society guys was somehow tied to Welch's, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, like the grape juice company. And I don't think that's the case anymore, but if you go way back, and it was these lower levels of capital that had more of a free market libertarian outlook that felt like they were being crushed. And that's what we're seeing here. And we're seeing the lower levels of capital that feel like they're being crushed and feel like desperate to not go out of business and have Amazon and Walmart walk all over them, right? Home Depot that's had to close all of its stores. I don't know if folks noticed, but I saw on Tucker Carlson, they kept bringing up Home Depot, you can't plant tomatoes. You can't go to Home Depot. You can't go to Home Depot. Well, that's Bernie Marcus. You can't go to Home Depot and shop and make profits for Bernie Marcus right now. Bernie Marcus is feeling it, but you can still go to Walmart. Unbelievable. All right, folks. So we've got super chats to get to. But before we do that, why don't we do that thing that we always do, where people say their name and the location, and we call you out as I call you out as I see you. I sip some orange juice, and we do our little roll call, so we can see who all is with us. Folks, if you haven't remembered to hit the like button, be sure to hit that like button. Be sure to hit the subscribe button. Be sure to hit the bell so you get notifications. A lot of people find these lives purely because of the notifications. If you can tweet this out, that would be great. If you can post it on Reddit, that would be great. Be sure to subscribe. Be absolutely sure to subscribe. We were approaching the 10K mark. This is great times. Be sure to subscribe. Be sure to hit the notifications bell. Empire, Michigan, says Ryan. Robert from Texas, right? Bauxite from the Philippines. Joshua Tree, California, says Kinky, howdy. Howdy to you. Northern Ontario, Canada. Copenhagen. New Orleans. Heidi from Edinburgh, Scotland. Fellow New Yorker. Hi from Dundee, UK. Heyo from London. Memphis. Lumbumba, Spain. Scotland, but in Canada. Phoenix. Gautler, Mississippi. Houston, Texas. Columbia. Puerto Rico. Yale Country, Connecticut, 2 hours south of Los Angeles, Australia, Lee County, North Carolina gang, Heyo from California, Baltimore, Lafayette, California, Bendigo, Australia, David Fox, Robert from Hawaii, Armando from Brazil, Salem, Oregon, Vallejo, California, UK, Sami, Mr. Red, I'm Mark from California. Hello, Caleb Maupin. North Carolina, Mark Shear. New Jersey, Lady Ravenhair. Ramiro in Los Angeles. Akeem from the Netherlands. Paul from Workingham, UK. Arthur Porter, yo from Arizona. East Germany, Etatis. Kansas City, Missouri, native Californian. Tim from the UK. Ken from Connecticut. Pomona, California. Momenon. Hey, I'm from Northern Italy, says Androvich, and I managed a conversation from Mike with PA. I don't know what that means. Hello from Fairhope. Hi from Northern Virginia, UK. The DNC screwed us again. Trevor Ireland says T-Mac. Las Vegas, Nevada. Wow, what a crowd. What a crowd we've got here today. Mike from PA. Hi from Croatia. New Orleans, Huey Long. Michael in Ithaca, New York. Up there with Cornell University. Michael Ristorcucci. Right? Who else is with us? Someone from Hrvatska. I don't know where that is. Zimbabwe. Okay. Madrid, Spain. Hello from Norway. Arctic Angel. Hello from Corona County, California, says Space Communist. How ironic it must be. How ironic it must be. So, folks, I see there were some super chats. Hi from Mississippi, says JT24. Croatia, says Novan Noir. Los Angeles, CA. Fort Lauderdale, Florida. All right. So the first super chat, Fresno, California. They just keep coming in, folks. Keep coming in. And be sure to tweet this out. Be sure to tweet this out. Get your friends watching. Tweet this out. Hit the like button. Hit the subscribe button. Super chat me if you want me to talk about anything. I'm just going to boom, boom, boom these super chats. I've got other material. Hi from Austin. Dylan from Massachusetts. I'm going to boom, boom, boom through these super chats. I can set up a Discord so that the community has a place to gather. I don't know how that works. I'm not a Discord person, but I'm not opposed to building community. If you want to build community around these lives, do it. I mean, we need community now more than ever. More than ever. All right. So someone asked me, do I support the PSL? I do not support any of the existing communist parties in the United States at this time. I have friends in many of them. Let me put it that way. I know a lot of good people that are in PSL, a lot of good PSL folks. I know there's a lot of PSL folks who watch this live. There's also a lot of people in the Communist Party who watch these lives. There's a lot of people in different groups who watch these lives. But I'm not aligned with any political grouping. I was in a group that has historical ties to PSL for a long time, so I know kind of the inside story of some splitting and sectarianism, and I don't want to go there. I really don't want to go there. My major difference with PSL is this. It's this. PSL believes that the way to get to socialism is by having peaceful, legal demonstrations, and that's basically PSL's main activity is that they manage protests, right? They get the permits in Washington, D.C., they set up a stage, they set up the microphone, and that's what they believe the focus is. And PSL has stated many times its goal is to, quote, take over the movement and then take power. I think that we need to get out of the movement and get to the masses. There are millions of people in the United States who have never met a socialist, never met a communist, and have no understanding of what we believe. And as a result of that, they're desperate for answers amid this society-wide crisis, social and financial capital. And as a result of that, they have no idea what we believe, and so they're turning to all kinds of crazy ideas. I mean, folks, I was on Modern Day Debates this week doing a debate. Look at some of the other debates they have on there. Flat Earth debates are very popular on Modern Day Debates. They also have debates about UFOs and space aliens. They have debates about did dinosaurs and humans coexist, right? People are desperate. People are very, very desperate. They want to find out what is wrong, and if they don't get Marxist answers, if someone is not going to them and preaching Marxism in a very clear and concise way and putting forward what Marxists have always believed, if people aren't doing that, they're going to pick up flat Earth ideas. They're going to pick up UFO ideas. They're going to turn to anything, right? It is absolutely necessary to go out and spread Marxist ideas. Absolutely, positively necessary, right? And there are certain people who say, no, that's intellectual. That's too bookish. It's about the struggle. It's about the movement, and they want to control the protest cage. They want to be in charge of the protest cage. That's not where I'm at. I'm sorry. I'm on here preaching Marxism, right? And And that's a political difference. It's good that these rallies are happening. I'm not opposed to people protesting against wars and protesting against police brutality and injustice. That's people should be doing that. But I think the aim should be to get to the masses, and that we're in a weird situation where what you can call the movement, the kind of people who go to liberal rallies, are in some cases more reactionary than the masses. Most of the masses right now are anti-war. Right? Most of the masses right now are tired of the wars. However, most of the people who go to stop Trump protests are more pro-war than the masses. In fact, they think that Trump is a puppet of the Russians. They think that Trump is evil for meeting and wanting peace with North Korea. The masses are anti-war, but the movement, if you mean liberal activists who go to stop Trump rallies, are more right-wing. So the strategy of trying to become king of the protest cage, trying to be king of the movement, trying to force, trying to make it so that whatever the latest trendy liberal cause is, people come to your rally around it, and you control the sound system at the rally around whatever the latest trendy liberal CNN cause is. That is not a strategy I think is correct. So I used to do that. For years, that's what I did. When I was in this other group that was kind of like PSL, that was what we did. Whatever the latest trendy liberal cause was, whether it was, fast food forward and fast food workers, or, Trayvon Martin, or, whatever the latest trendy Occupy Wall Street. I was at Occupy Wall Street more than anybody in that group. Whatever the latest trendy liberal cause was, we tried to set up a stage and have a rally around it. And that was how we were going to make the revolution. And that was not a correct strategy. And so I disagree tactically with PSL. There you go. So you asked me what I think of the PSL. Great folks. Their international line is they're anti-imperialist through and through. A lot of communist groups have compromised on that and are not anti-imperialist. PSL is anti-imperialist through and through, but it maintains movementist politics. And I know why that is. That's because of their history with Sam Marcy. They were split from the Workers' World Party, and coming out of the 1960s, like really in the mid-70s, Workers' World Party started trying to be the leaders of the movement. They did things like they had the All People's Congress was an organization that they set up, and they were trying to become the leaders of the anti-war protest movements, right? The Socialist Workers' Party, the Trotskyite Party, was collapsing at the time, and they had been the ones that would reserve all the permits in Washington, D.C. and have the peaceful legal rallies. The SWP was collapsing, so the Workers' World Party stepped up. The first big, huge national rally they had that was massive, I believe. Me and Boxspite set up a community. Okay, there's a community on Discord. Glad to hear it. I don't know how that works, but I'm glad it's there. But yeah, I believe the first time the Workers' World Party ever had a mass demonstration of any, like a massive demonstration that was not explicitly communist, was in Boston against the anti-busing riots, 1974. They had a rally called Say No to Racism, and it was the first time they'd ever done it. But then in 1981, they had a rally to protest against the inauguration of Ronald Reagan, Say No to Reaganism. It was called the People's Anti-War Mobilization. And it was like 100,000 people. It was a massive demonstration in Washington, D.C., and the Workers' World Party basically staged it all. They did all the work, and they were good at it. And they became, as the 80s went on, the 90s, and then especially during the invasion of Iraq, they became kind of the stage managers of liberal rallies, And one good thing about them is that they were more anti-imperialist than most liberals, right? They would have Palestinian speakers. They would have speakers from various, from talking about issues like Colombia, talking about Cuba and such. And so that was good. I mean, they were introducing more of an anti-imperialist message into the movement. But overall, the movement was a product of the 1960s. The hippies protesting the war, burning their draft cards, that's a 1960s phenomenon. And politics has moved on. And we're at a period where liberal activism is more pro-imperialist and more pro-establishment, right? They want conspiracy theories outlawed on the internet because they, confuse people and get them to not believe CNN, right? That liberal activists are more pro-establishment and more confused than average Americans are. So the time is now to get out of the movement, and get to those masses of people that are more open than ever, that are mad at the establishment. Get to them, organize them, right? Get them to understand Marxism. There's an ideological struggle that needs to go on. That's why I'm on here talking about Marxism. All right, that was a long answer. The Soviet family. Well, the Soviet family emerged. Okay, so coming out of the Russian Revolution, right? You had the Bolsheviks, which were, the leaders of the Bolsheviks were people from middle class, wealthier backgrounds. You know, uh, Lenin, Litvinov, who else? Trotsky, Bukharin, Zinoviev. These were people that were from like middle class backgrounds, had, levels of education, and become Marxists, and were very, very liberal in their social views, right? There was a lot of, they were for sexual freedom, for example. And their views were probably, compared to most people in Western Europe and in the United States, even at that time, were very, very liberal, right? You have Alexandria Kollontai. You have talk of abolishing marriage. At one point, there was the glass of water theory, that in a socialist society, having sex will be as meaningless as drinking a glass of water, which Lenin opposed. So there was this very, very socially liberal, wing that just wanted complete social freedom, right? That was for, lifting all restrictions on sexuality, lifting all obligation, right? And they took power, right, as the Bolshevik Party, but you have to remember who brought them to power. It was the Russian working class, but also the Russian peasantry, right? And Russia was a majority peasant country at that time. And the Russian peasantry were some of the most conservative people in the world at that time, right? The Russian peasantry were deeply, deeply religious, deeply, deeply traditional. And they had some of the most conservative views about family and sexuality and marriage and tradition of anyone in the world. Thousands of years you'd had the Russian Tsar, the Russian Orthodox Church, and they had the most conservative views you can possibly imagine. So it was this weird contradiction. On the one hand, you had the most far left, liberal, socially liberal, views, and on the other, you had the most conservative. And it was a problem. And the way that during the Russian Civil War, posters were put up everywhere saying the Bolsheviks want to socialize wives and children. There was a huge effort by the counter-revolutionary forces to try and play up the idea the Bolsheviks were all a bunch of sexual perverts or whatever, and they were going to tear apart the family, and that was a big thing. So the rise of Stalin, right? After the death of Lenin, you have the left opposition of Trotsky. And the rise of Stalin, it was, in a way, it was what you could call a synthesis between these two extremes, right? You had two trends that really saw things differently. You had Alexandria Kollontai and the most Bolshevik leaders, which were very, very liberal. And you had Russian peasants that were very, very conservative. And Stalin created a synthesis that worked, which was called the Soviet family. And that synthesis that stabilized Russian society, it was like a compromise, right? On the one hand, women got education just like men. Women worked in factories alongside men. Women became electrical engineers. Women took leading roles. Women were in the military, right? Huge advances were made for women, right? This idea that women shouldn't work outside the home, should just be homemakers, property of their husbands, gotten rid of. But at the same time, right? They did downplay any idea, this idea that the family is a patriarchal institution. Oh, no. They glorified the Soviet family. They had posters. We believe in the Soviet family. Mother, father, kids. Number one. What else did they do? They outlawed abortion. They said we need to populate the country. We need more people in order to build socialism. And they argued, I don't agree with them. I think abortion should be legal, and it's up to a woman whether she has one or not. But they argued during the 1930s that abortion was unnecessary in the Soviet Union because guaranteed health care and education was guaranteed by the state. So they outlawed abortion. They also outlawed homosexuality. They said homosexuality, was problematic. It was bourgeois or something like that. So you had a compromise. The Soviet family of the Stalin era was a compromise, and it was kind of a merger between the most far left liberal forces and the most conservative forces, and Stalin was a synthesis. And it worked. It worked, right? The Russian peasantry could agree to it. A lot of Russian women, who had come from families that were literate for generations, became engineers and scientists and did amazing things. At the same time, abortion was outlawed. In fact, they gave medals to women who had more than 10 children. It was complicated. I'm not saying it was right or wrong. I'm saying it was what worked in that moment. If the Bolsheviks had continued with the more Trotskyite, ideas, and if Alexandra Kollontai's ideas had continued to coexist, it's very likely that the Bolshevik Party and the Communist Party would have been overthrown. And that's how politics tends to work. It's not about simply, you don't get a blank piece of paper when you have a revolution, right? Socialists don't come to power, have a blank piece of paper, they can just write whatever they want on it. It doesn't work that way, right? You have people that have all the baggage, all the history from the old system. They have their beliefs. And if socialists are going to maintain power, they need to empower those people, and they need to maintain the support of those people. So it's complicated. And I'm going to be widely attacked for saying this, like I always am. This drives people crazy when I point this out. I'm just supposed to say Stalin was evil, Stalin was homophobic, Stalin outlawed abortion, he was evil. It's not that simple, folks, right? It's not that simple, right? You can't just declare things from above and expect that. It was complicated, right? And what Trotsky called the Thermidor in the family, the Soviet family, was at that time a great advance in terms of human rights for women in Russia, but it was also a step back from what the Bolsheviks had implemented in the first years of the Russian Revolution. That's just the reality of the situation, and many writers agree, both pro-Stalin and pro-Trotsky writers confirm that basically this was what would work in Russia in the 1930s, and it worked very well. Now, what's interesting is in the 1960s, abortion was widely practiced in the Soviet Union, widely practiced. And so that ban on abortion, that lasted not very long. I think after the Second World War in like the 1950s, especially in the 60s, abortion became extremely common in the Soviet Union. So it's complicated, but that's what the Soviet family was about. And it was a compromise, and it worked. And that this is how politics works in the real world, right? Take it or leave it. Okay, next super chat. China's economy. Well, China's economy obviously was badly hurt by coronavirus. This is the first drop in GDP that they've ever had since the reform and opening up. Not since 1978 has their economy been as bad as it is right now. But it's way better than the rest of the world is right now, because they beat coronavirus before we did. So they're starting to get going again, right? It's bad, but it's better than we're doing. The rest of the world is still suffering, but China is starting to grind ahead. And one thing, to be fair, is that China is now producing the medical supplies that are desperately needed around the world, like gloves, like thermometers, right? Like masks. China's making them. They got factories and they're pumping them out. China has a huge apparatus of production. They have a state central plan where they don't have to wait for the market to catch up. The government can just say, all right, we're doing this. And China is ready. They're coming back to life after coronavirus, and they're charting them out. And I think one thing we're going to see from this, one thing that we're going to see out of this, is China continue to pull ahead, right? They dealt with coronavirus. They had it. They warned the rest of the world. The world ridiculed them. How dare you threaten to arrest people if they leave their houses? This is draconian. How dare they? All these, and they beat coronavirus. Whereas Donald Trump is telling people to go out and protest. We can't enforce anything. We got states that say, Louisiana, well, we're not New York. We don't need to implement. I mean, this is a problem. And we can't, if you look at it, we should have had a total shutdown from day one. And instead we approached it way too slowly, and we're having a problem here. China, they dealt with it. They're moving on, and their economy is starting to come back. We, on the other hand, not so good. Not so good, folks. So I think the Chinese economy is going to come out of this way ahead. Must be said. Now, I mean, like I said, first downturn in GDP. Watched the China and multipolarity video this morning for the first time at the level of commercials for Epoch Times. Good move, brother. Yes, well, that interview with my good friend, the attorney and China expert Wen Hongyu, watch it. I recommend you watch it. Watch it. He really is full of insights. I mean, he studies this stuff. Watch the interview. I mean, it's one of the last videos I did on here. It's an interview on China, coronavirus, and multipolarity from a good friend of mine who's very educated. And you can just check it out. Watch it. He says it better than I do. So check it out. I'm glad people liked it. Okay, China economy. All right, the Bill Gates conspiracy theory. Well, here's the thing, folks. I mean, coronavirus, it's real. It's not synthetic. It's not a bioweapon. It's a real thing, right? Probably originated in China. Could have possibly originated somewhere else. We don't know, but probably originated in China. But why are people saying this about Bill Gates? Why are people saying this about Bill Gates? Because Bill Gates is a Malthusian. He goes around talking about the dangers of overpopulation, the need to drastically reduce the human population. That's what he does. I mean, he goes around saying we need to reduce the human population. There's too many people in the world, and that's dangerous stuff. So people who don't, and also let's be real, the tech companies, the software giants, they're doing great. Bezos is doing great. All the online streamers, Walmart, they're doing great, while all the other capitalists are suffering. That's why people have this narrative. They're wrong. It's not a conspiracy, but Malthusianism is an evil idea. Folks, Prince Philip, Duke of Ellington, or Duke of Edinburgh, Prince Philip, this is what he said. He said, quote, "If I were reincarnated, it would be as a deadly virus to lower population levels." That is a quote from a member of the British royal family. If I were reincarnated, it would be as a deadly virus to lower population levels. That is not a fake quote. That is a real quote. And the elites of Britain were obsessed with reducing the human population. And one of the earliest major economists was Robert Thomas Malthus. And Robert Thomas Malthus, he put forward the idea at the time of the French Revolution, as the French Revolution, the Reign of Terror was happening. There's all these questions. Why is this happening? Why is the French Revolution happening? Why is it occurring? Well, this top British economist, one of the first major economists, said, oh, it's happening because there are too many people in the world. Those French people have been having too many children. They've been breeding too rapidly. And as a result, the food supply goes down, and you have mass suffering. And we need to reduce the population. This is a time where the human population was far, far, far lower, like less than 1 billion people. He's saying this, right? Nowhere near what it is now. I mean, the human population now is 6 billion people, approximately. So, it's just nonsense. But this is what happens, a neo-Malthusianism, right? I mean, Marx rips Robert Malthus to shreds. You should read Theories of Surplus Value. Richard Wolff, the economist, actually told me I should read Theories of Surplus Value. My training, it was published after Marx's death. It was edited by Karl Kautsky, so I didn't read it. You read Foster, they don't talk about that stuff. Grundrisse, Theories of Surplus Value, my Marxist training ignored what was published after his death, only focused on what Marx published during his lifetime. But Theories of Surplus Value is Marx's notebooks, and there's a lot in there about Malthus, about Robert Malthus, and it rips him to shreds. It was junk economics. He was a hitman. He was hired to write books about economics to promote the ideas of the British ruling elite when it came to rent, when it came to the French Revolution and all of that. And his theory of overpopulation is bad, right? People build the economy. When the population grows, you have more people. Those people are consumers. Those people are workers. They create things. I mean, this idea, it just doesn't add up. People say Stalin made a mistake on the Chinese Revolution. I don't see where. Okay, well, I'll talk about that. That's fine. Stalin on Chinese Revolution. I'll talk about that. That's on the list. Thank you for the super chat. All right, but but yeah, if you read Theories of Surplus Value and neo-Malthusianism is a big trend among the ruling class. The Rockefeller family are major believers in neo-Malthusianism. They sponsored huge conferences, like going back hundreds of years, conferences in London, conferences in New York City, about the need for birth control and the cruelty of charity and how feeding people is wrong because then they breed, right? I mean, this is sick stuff. And they actually bought off Margaret Sanger. Margaret Sanger was a communist, the woman who started Planned Parenthood. She was a communist, and she had to flee the country, and she fled to London to escape criminal charges. And when she was in London, Rockefeller bought her off. She abandoned Marxism. She came back to the United States. She started the Birth Control League, and she set up the first birth control clinic in New York City, or in the country, actually. It was in Brownsville, Brooklyn. And Margaret Sanger became, the major fighter for birth control. The Birth Control League is now what's called Planned Parenthood. And she had gone from being a communist who believed in birth control as a way to promote women's rights. She went from that to being a Ku Klux Klan, ally. She wrote a book about how birth control will help eliminate, weaker races. She was a racist. She spoke at Ku Klux Klan meetings across New Jersey. She wrote a book called The Cruelty of Charity, urging people not to donate food to poor people because they'll breed. She was promoting some sick Ayn Rand stuff, right? But she went, but again, she was only in socialism for the sex, right? If you look at, her newspaper, Rebel Woman, in New York City, it was about sex. I mean, and she was interested in socialism because socialists believed in free love. When she saw the Soviet Union and the Soviet family, well, she didn't like it so much. And the Rockefellers, they believed in birth control. So she started getting funding by the ruling class to promote birth control stuff. And you read about the history of the Birth Control League and all of that. Margaret Sanger went from socialism to Malthusianism when she found people in the ruling class who agreed with her. And she was an Irish American woman from a very wealthy family. Margaret Sanger is an interesting case. I'm talking about her in my new book. And I'm not opposed to birth control. People can use birth control. I'm not opposed to the legality of abortion. But at the same time, a lot of the ruling class is very much in favor of that. And the Malthusian agenda of reducing the human population is very anti-working class. So it's complicated. It's very, very complicated. Why are some Marxist-Leninists anti-SWCC and Deng? I don't know what SWCC is. I know what Deng is. What's SWCC? What's SWCC? Can someone tell me what SWCC is? Um, Socialism with Chinese characteristics. Okay. All right. So I think I talked about Malthusianism, and Malthusianism is anti-Marxist, but it's widespread. Bill Gates is a Malthusian. I would say the richest of the rich, that Eastern establishment, they are Malthusians. So that's what that's about. And there you go. Okay. A new Cold War with China. I mean, we're in one already. I mean, Obama had his Asian pivot, building up a U.S. military presence in the Pacific. I noticed this. I remember back in 2000, I think it was 2008, like in the lead up to the 2008 elections, where you had the Republican debates, you had the Democrat debates, and I watched it, and I noted to myself that it seemed like the difference between the two parties when it came to foreign policy was that Republicans talked about Iran, they talked about the Middle East, they talked about Muslim terror. Democrats talked about China. Right? Democrats were like, China is the enemy, we got to fight China. They focused on demonizing China. Republicans focused on Middle East stuff. Now, obviously, things have shifted, but that was kind of where the dialogue was at that point. And Cold War with China, there's an increasing escalation with China. The stronger China gets, the more its economy expands, the more it's a competitor with Wall Street. Apple hates China because Huawei makes way better phones, way cheaper than they do. Huawei is a much better company. So that's why Wall Street can't stand China. Steel manufacturers can't stand China. China makes half the steel in the world. Every ounce of steel sold by China is an ounce of steel someone didn't buy from an American corporation, or a German corporation, or a South Korean corporation, right? I mean, China is a competitor. They've gone from being the sick man of Asia, one of the poorest countries in the world, to being an economic powerhouse, and they can't stand it. And the more they expand, and the more they build up developing countries and help them expand by building power plants, things like that. The more they do that, the more Wall Street is going to hate them. They are cutting into Wall Street's profits, and their Belt and Road Initiative. They're doing good things, and Wall Street can't stand that. Wall Street wants the world to stay poor so that Wall Street and London can stay rich. Let me repeat that. Wall Street wants the world to stay poor so that they can stay rich. That's what imperialism is. And China has drastically built itself up with socialism, and they can't stand that. And the reason China has been able to raise its living standards so rapidly is because the means of production are controlled by society, and the state controls the economy. It's not a profit-centered economy. The Communist Party is in power. Okay, next super chat. New Cold War with, drawing negative attention. I don't know what that means. Someone said, should we be drawing negative attention to ourselves right now? Well, we can't be going out and protesting. I mean, I guess if you're a Trumper, you can, but you shouldn't. You shouldn't be doing it because it's bad for public health, right? And you shouldn't be going out and protesting, right? I know some people are saying we should have like car rallies. I know that's a suggestion I've heard. People recommended, driving around in your car, like car rallies where you stay in your cars. But honestly, right now, more than ever, is the time for ideological education, right? For people to be learning Marxism, discussing Marxism, be doing what we're doing here on this live. I'm working on my short book that I've told you all about, and now is the time to educate ourselves. So, I don't drawing negative attention. Drawing positive attention, I think. Can you talk about the difference between social and finance capital? Well, finance capital, that's the lending of money, right? That's, banking houses, lending houses, right? That's credit. Whereas social capital is, I believe, I don't know if social capital is how I've heard it described, but manufacturing, business, business owners, etc. That's a little bit different. And people talk about physical economy versus paper economy, credit economy. I think that's what you're getting at. And the rise of imperialism was the dominance of credit and finance capital over industrial capital. And it leads to a problem, right? Because finance capital can become wealthier with nothing being created. And that's the problem. And if you go back, there's a whole debates about usury and all of that, because, when you get money by having money, you're not creating anything. Only human labor and nature create wealth. That's Karl Marx, right? He said it is labor and nature that are the source of all wealth, not money, right? Money only creates value when it is mixed with human labor, when it's mixed with natural resources, but money in and of itself doesn't do anything. It's just a means to an end. Money is fake, right? The Catholic Church used to say money is sterile. And it is. Money is sterile. So that's what you need to understand about that. And I think that, when you have a financialized economy, which we heavily do in the United States right now, that's a big problem because money isn't real. And if you don't expand the physical economy, right? If you don't have infrastructure, if you don't have actual production going up, if people's living standards are not increasing, if people are not spending more, you have a problem. And that's what we saw in 2008. This is capitalism. This is the problems of capitalism. It's one of the problems of capitalism. And as financial capital assumes control, you can have a situation where they get richer as the society gets poorer. Industrial capital, on the one hand, right, they're vicious to their workers. They want to pay their workers as little as possible. They're anti-union and all of that. But at the same time, they want society overall to get wealthier. The wealthier people are, the more people will buy their products, etc. Finance capital doesn't see it that way, right? As long as they can keep lending people money, people are poorer, they can lend them, they'll be even more desperate to lend them, to borrow money from them, right? It's the relationship of a banker to the means of production versus the relationship of a factory owner to the rest of society, right? It's complicated. And I think that's what the person who sent the chat was asking about. Orange juice. All right, so the next super chat question. Stalin on the Chinese Revolution. Did Stalin make a mistake? Well, this is a big lie from the Trotskyites. I like to tell the anecdote that when, James Cannon, who was the founder of American Trotskyism, he was put on trial for forming this secret Trotskyite faction within the Communist Party USA, and they had a trial to expel him from the party, and they gave him his trial, and they had the person testifying against him at his trial within the Communist Party get up, and it was a person from the book publishing company of the Communist Party, the International Publishers, and they said to him, does James Cannon buy lots of books by Trotsky? He said, no, but James Cannon buys every book that we have on China. And everyone knows that China is a Trotskyite subject. And it was. The main criticism that Trotsky had of the Communist International was related to China. In China, you had Dr. Sun Yat-sen. Dr. Sun Yat-sen was a widely loved figure, wildly charismatic figure who wanted to build a modern China. And he built his nationalist movement, it was called. Nationalist movement, or KMT, Kuomintang, right? It was a movement to modernize China and to fight the imperialists. And it had three principles: independence, democracy, and the people's livelihoods. And, the communists, when the Communist Party was formed in 1921, they joined it. And it was the best thing around. I mean, it was they boycotted Japanese goods. They had the May 4th movement, which was a huge uprising against the fact that Chinese territory after World War I was not given back to China in the Treaty of Versailles. I seek organization without drawing negative attention. Okay, I mean, I'll guess I can come back to that. There was the Sun Yat-sen's movement, the KMT, the Kuomintang, was an amazing uprising within Chinese society, and it was massive. And it eventually, it toppled the emperor. It created the People's Republic, or not the People's Republic. It created the Republic of China in 1911, and it was progressive. And, there were labor unions that supported the KMT. There were also members of the capitalist class, bourgeois nationalists who supported it, right? The three principles, independence, democracy, and the people's livelihood. The third principle of the people's livelihood more or less meant socialism, right? It wasn't clear. It was more of like kind of social democracy, but it was the idea was the means of production would be controlled by the state, and everything would be made to give every Chinese person equal opportunities. It was very, very socialistic and progressive. It was great. I mean, the KMT movement, when it started, was very, very good. And so when the KMT government emerged, they had to fight these warlords that were fighting against the KMT government. And so the Soviet Union gave military training and support to the KMT, to the Republic of China, to fight against the warlords. And they set up a military academy where not only did these folks learn, military stuff, they also learned communism at this military academy set up by the Soviet Union. And Chiang Kai-shek got training there, Mao got training there, all kinds of people. There was a member of the Soviet Communist Party who was dispatched to China to be an advisor to the KMT, Mikhail Borodin. And, China and the Soviet Union had a good relationship, and the Communist Party was a faction inside the KMT government. And they recruited millions of people, and their message wasn't that they were a rival or an alternative, that their message was that if you want to really carry out Dr. Sun Yat-sen's vision of, independence, democracy, and the people's livelihood, the way to carry it out, the way to create it, is to join the Communist Party. And the Communist Party went from an organization of a small number of people to being an organization of millions of people. It was the right thing to do. Trotsky didn't think so. Trotsky said that, oh no, KMT, it has millionaires in it. It's a bourgeois nationalist movement. The communists should be hostile to the KMT. They should expose it as a bourgeois organization. They should only organize the railroad workers. You read Trotsky's writings on China, it's nuts. It's completely nuts. So, the Chinese communists took up this question. Should we leave the KMT, form a separate political party that's hostile, or can we function as a faction within the KMT? Well, the Chinese communists, they addressed that question. They had intense arguments over it, but they decided to stay in the KMT. So, 1927, right, there was a military coup by Chiang Kai-shek. Chiang Kai-shek was a leader of the KMT. Dr. Sun Yat-sen had died, and Chiang Kai-shek became an anti-communist, and he started killing communists across China. It was called the White Terror. And if you read Trotsky's writings, Trotsky maintains somehow, it is Stalin's fault that Chiang Kai-shek killed all these communists. That doesn't make any sense, right? That it was, because they had joined the KMT, because they weren't a separate party, because they basically didn't set themselves up to get killed immediately, right? Because they made allies, because it was an opportunism, and they deserved to. It's unbelievable. Trotsky blames Stalin for Chiang Kai-shek's White Terror, his murdering of communists, and that's nuts, right? Now, ultimately, Mao Zedong recognized he had a political difference with most of the Chinese Communist Party. He wasn't a Trotskyist, but he argued that instead of organizing in the cities, the Chinese Communist Party should organize the peasantry. And he wrote a very good document just a couple months before the White Terror started called Report on the Peasant Uprising in Hunan. And that document, eventually, as the cities, as communists were being persecuted by Chiang Kai-shek, it was the peasantry that ended up being organized by the communists. And it was a peasant revolution in China. It was largely the peasantry in China that had the revolution. Little known fact. Well, not little known fact, widely acknowledged. Rural People's War, right? So, there was a difference, right? That Mao was saying to organize the peasantry. Stalin was more organizing the cities. But ultimately, this notion that Stalin sold the Chinese Revolution down the river, that's ridiculous. And even up until his death, Trotsky's articles about China are pretty hostile to the peasantry. Trotsky hated peasants, right? Trotsky had it in his mind that the peasantry is a reactionary class. And he just was opposed. You read his writings on China up into the late 1930s when Mao is doing all these amazing things. Trotsky writes about Mao with contempt. This is a peasant army. Peasants are no good. That's Trotsky, right? Trotsky, is very much represents that revolutionary intelligentsia, that middle class urban faction that has kind of contempt for the people and wants revolutionary chaos and kind of views the masses of people as dangerous. He represents some of the worst tendencies within the revolutionary intelligentsia. That's just a fact. And so he was hostile to Mao. So yeah, that's something that Trotskyists always say, is that Stalin sold the Chinese, somehow it's Stalin's fault that Chiang Kai-shek killed all these people. That's ridiculous. I don't buy that at all. Yeah. Okay. So why are so many Marxists anti-Deng and anti-socialism with Chinese characteristics? Well, there's a number of reasons for that. I think, well, first of all, there's let's go at this. There's layers to this. Okay, there are many layers to this. So the first layer to that question, why are so many Marxists anti-China, anti-Deng, and anti-socialism with Chinese characteristics, is the same. The first layer to that is the same reason that so many Marxists are anti-Cuba, so many Marxists are anti-Venezuela, so many Marxists are against the Soviet Union, so many Marxists are opposed to all socialist countries, because Marxism now is dominated by academia, and it's by people who think Marxism is the Frankfurt School and is a good way to write movie reviews, and think that all the socialist countries were actually fascist or they were state capitalist, and that Marxism just means worker cooperatives, and this junk is out there, right? So most of what passes for Marxism in the United States right now is not Marxism and is totally ridiculous, right? You talk about neo-Trotskyism, the third camp Trotskyites and how they ISO type people and social democracy and all that. So most people extolling Marxism in the United States, most of the voices that are lifted up, the people who get Ford Foundation money and money from CIA-linked foundations and the Rockefellers, the people who get academic grants to write books in the name of Marxism, they have this kind of view. They're not They're not Marxists. And they promote Marxism in a way that gets them grant money, that's safe, that doesn't get them in trouble, right? And that's those folks. So that's the first layer to it, right? And they're against any socialism. Any country that emerges that is actually practicing socialism, they're going to be against, right? So that's the first layer, right? And I mean, I joke about this. The way to be loved by the American left is to lose, right? I swear. Rosa Luxemburg, widely loved. Why? She lost. Market sector, writing it down. No, but I'm serious. Do you want to be a hero at Left Forum? Do you want to have books written about you, eulogizing you, and making you just widely loved by the left? Lose. Rosa Luxemburg lost, so she's safe. Why? Because if she had actually taken power and started building socialism in Germany, the New York Times would have accused her of violating human rights. And then all these cowards, all these people with no real principles would have had to denounce her in order to keep getting their Grant Foundation money and getting tenure, right? Trotsky. Why is Trotsky so loved? Trotsky violated human rights. Trotsky sent a lot of people to the firing squad. Trotsky executed all kinds of people. He was pretty vicious during. Don't tell me Trotsky was a humanitarian who believed in democracy, but he lost, right? And he was opposed to Stalin and the Soviet Union, so he's safe, right? Anarchists in Spain. There are a million people, I guarantee you, have written their college thesis about some anarchist somewhere in Spain, and if only he had led the revolution, Spain would now be socialist. But oh no, the evil communists did it. Lose. The left loves losers because they're safe, right? You're not going to get any flack. As long as your revolutionary lost, he can be pure, he can be good. If only he had taken power. Oh, he never violated any human rights. Why? He lost, right? I mean, I'm sorry, but that's the nature of this. If somebody loses, it's safe. You can get your grant money. You can get an A+ on your grade from your professor. You can be a popular kid. You can fit in. You can say, "Oh, I hate Stalin too. I'm a good socialist." You can do all of that. You can be a little punk, because you're not attached to anything controversial. So that's the first reason. The first reason that most people who go around calling themselves Marxists want nothing to do with China, because they're cowards, plain and simple. But there's another layer to that. There's beyond academic Marxism, beyond cowardly hipster Marxists, beyond people who think that socialism is just what they nationalized the pencil factory. If I have a pencil factory and every worker in it has a share, that's socialism. Beyond that crowd. Okay, we're getting a little bit another layer, right? What about among people who maybe like Cuba? Maybe they like China during the Mao era. What's going on there? Well, there's a couple layers to this. So first of all, you remember that there was the Sino-Soviet Split, right? 1961, China cut off its economic ties to the Soviet Union. It was the Soviet Union cut China off, actually. And, when that happened, the Soviet Union was pushing for a détente with the imperialists, and China was pushing, anti-imperialism. Is it right to call Batista a fascist? No. Batista. And they were pushing détente. Right? The Soviets were pushing détente. China was pushing global Marxist revolution. And so you had this division, right? And the communist parties of the world, thank you, Herb Bryant, for that super chat. The communist parties of the world were supporting the Soviet Union. So you had new communist parties that were being formed that supported China, right? In the United States, you had, I think the first group that supported China was called Hammer and Steel. Eventually you had, the different groups, Progressive Labor Party, and eventually the Revolutionary Communist Party, and the October League, and Communist Workers' Party and stuff. And all over the world, you had the emergence of new communist parties that were pro-China, and were saying that the Soviet Union were sellouts. And the way China presented itself in these arguments was saying that they were more radical, and they were more communist, more radical and more communist than the Soviet Union. So, the Soviet communist parties would say those Chinese Maoists, they're far left, they're extremists, they're crazy. The Soviet communists presented themselves as sensible. They wanted détente. They wanted, they voted, they campaigned for Democrats. They favored a peaceful transition to socialism. These Maoists are ultra-left and crazy extremists. That was kind of the way the debate went. So the people who joined the Maoist groups tended to be more ultra-left kind of people. They were 60s radicals who liked to go out in the streets and break windows, and they thought the Communist Party were a bunch of phonies and sellouts, right? So that was the division. So when China shifted during the Deng era, right, the rise of Deng, where Deng is saying we need a market sector and all of that, it was very disorienting for these people, because their entire alliance with China had been on the basis of China being, the most radical. So when China is saying, well, we need to have a market sector, poverty is anti-communist, to get rich is glorious, it totally threw these people for a loop. They didn't know what to do about that, right? It confused them. So on that basis, most of them just declared, they'd been declaring the Soviet Union was capitalist all along, so China's putting out things that they don't agree with. Oh, it must not be, must not be socialist. That's the other thing. The other thing is Chinese foreign policy, right? Starting during the time of Mao in the 1969, right? The first thing was Angola. 1969, there was an armed uprising in Angola against the Portuguese colonialists, right? The MPLA, which was the Soviet-backed, communist-led resistance movement in Angola, was fighting the Portuguese. And China declared that the MPLA was actually, they were agents of what they called the Soviet imperialists. They were revisionists or whatever. So they formed their own communist group that was actually armed by the CIA to fight not against the Portuguese, but against the MPLA. And anyone who was a legitimate anti-imperialist had to go, wait a second, what's going on here? And it got worse, right? China was friendly to Pinochet and recognized Pinochet, right? China had this they called the theory of three worlds, right? And this was the Gang of Four, right? This is Mao's wife, three other people. They're called the Gang of Four, and they pushed this theory that that basically the Soviet Union was what they called the main danger to the people of the world, the main danger. And they had the theory of three worlds, that there were two imperialist powers, the Soviet Union and the United States. There was Europe, which was the second world, and there was the third world, and China was going to support countries in the third world that would develop. And, that meant aligning with, hard, like the Shah of Iran, for example, Haile Selassie in Ethiopia, all over the world. Mao was embracing puppets of Western capitalist imperialism in the name of being anti-Soviet, in the name of their theory of three worlds, etc. So you had Chinese foreign policy shifting, and that continued under Deng Xiaoping. And there was, Deng Xiaoping even invaded Vietnam. There was the Kampuchea War, 1979, or 1978-79, you had China invade Vietnam. So, China's foreign policy was not very revolutionary. And this continued. It started in the Mao era under the Gang of Four, but it continued under Deng Xiaoping. And in the 1980s, the center of revolution, in terms, one of the main focuses, I should say, of the revolutionary movement was Latin America, right? The Nicaragua, the Sandinistas, El Salvador, Cuba. It was like Latin America was kind of the main place that there was like revolutionary activity going on. And China didn't support any of those revolutions. Their foreign policy was very much pro-US during that time. So because of that, a lot of people in the United States who were anti-imperialist, anti-war activists, at that point, if you were being radicalized in the 1980s, you didn't think much of China, because it's like, you're excited about Cuba, you're excited about the Sandinistas, China's nowhere on any of that. So a lot of them, it never occurred to them that China was any good. So on the basis of that, yeah, a lot of them just didn't pay any attention to China. Now, there's another layer to this, which is in the 1990s, Jiang Zemin, who was the leader of the Chinese Communist Party, actually went as far as saying that China's goal was to adopt a Western liberal democratic system. Right? Jiang Zemin actually said that. He said China's goal is to transition to a Western liberal democratic system. Well, obviously that doesn't sound very radical. In China, in the 1990s, the Soviet Union fell, right? And China was getting a lot of foreign investment, and there was a lot of market reforms going on, and China worked its hardest not not to play up its radical side, right? And China really tried to emphasize that it was modernizing, but obviously that's changed. It's shifted. So it's complicated. It's complicated. China over the course of the 1990s, I mean, it became very close to Cuba during the early 90s, the special period it was called. It became very close to Cuba. It's complicated, right? China, and now Chinese foreign policy is very anti-imperialist, but it was a shift. So all of these layers, that's why people in the United States are confused about China, right? And I think that's why people in the United States who call themselves Marxists are confused about it. There's layers to it. There's the anti-communism of most people that claim to be Marxists. There's the Sino-Soviet split and the confusion. There's Chinese foreign policy. There's many different layers to it. But that's why there's so much confusion about China among Marxists in the United States. I hope that answers the question. Okay, so somebody asked me again, how do we organize now and seek negative attention? I mean, you can't organize now. I mean, for the most part, you can organize discussions like this. You can have classes. You can do education, but I mean, I don't know how one could organize any kind of protest or anything like that, and I'm not advocating people do that. So, I mean, I hope that answers your question. Is it accurate to call Batista a fascist? No, not really. I mean, see, prior to Batista coming to power, right, in Cuba, you had a pro-Franco government and a government that was more sympathetic to Hitler and to Italian fascism. Franco took power. I believe it was like in the Second World War, in the lead up to it, Batista took power, and he was more friendly to the United States. He was kind of anti-fascist, and that's why the official Cuban Communist Party, which was, I believe, was called the Popular Socialist Party, actually had seats in the Batista government on a local level. Let's remember that when the Cuban Revolution first happened, Fidel Castro did not support it. Or, I'm sorry, that's wrong. When the Cuban Revolution first happened, the Communist Party didn't support it, right? Raul Castro was a member of the Communist Party, but he broke discipline in the party to participate in it. And originally, in the first moments of the Cuban Revolution, the Communist Party didn't support the Cuban Revolution. They thought it was too extreme. They had elected seats in the government of Batista, and they ran some trade unions in Cuban cities, and they felt like Fidel was a little too radical. As the revolution got going, they changed their position, obviously. And actually, the Cuban Communist Party of today is a merger. It's not the Popular Socialist Party. The Popular Socialist Party merged with the July 26th movement, which was Fidel Castro's movement that he started, as well as something called the Democratic Youth, which was kind of an anti-imperialist Marxist youth group that was separate from the Communist Party. All three of them merged to form what is now the Cuban Communist Party. And if you look at it, most of the socialist countries of the world, the communist parties are mergers. I mean, that's not true for China or Russia, but like in North Korea, the Korean Workers' Party, that's not the Communist Party. It's not, right? You had the Communist Party of Korea, you had the Korean Social Democratic Party, you had the Korean Christian Party, you had all these kind of anti-Japanese resistance parties that eventually merged to form the Korean Workers' Party. And that's the case in most socialist countries. The Communist Party that has emerged is actually a merger of anti-imperialist parties that merge into one party on the basis of trying to build socialism. It's not like there's one party that just expands. It's actually a merger. I think that's fascinating. And for a long time, the socialist countries of Eastern Europe, they called themselves, what did they call themselves? They called themselves people's democracies. They called themselves people's democratic countries because they weren't fully socialist yet. I think that's fascinating. So there you go. I hope that answers the super chats. Now, one thing I really wanted to talk about on here is that we have to talk about the prisons in the United States right now, because the prisons right now are a death trap. I mean, it's very likely if you're arrested in the United States right now, you could die. Right? The conditions in the prisons, you cannot social distance in those prisons. You could die. I mean, being in jail right now is especially for anyone who's vulnerable, is a death sentence. And that you can't ignore that. I mean, that needs to be acknowledged. And, I know some folks who are very close to the case of Ramsey Orta. Ramsey Orta filmed the killing of Eric Garner. of the New York City Police, and he feels that his life is in danger right now by prison guards. Alarm bells are being sounded. That Ramsey Orta fears for his life. He fears violence from the guards. He fears that in this atmosphere of the pandemic and all of that, where they're letting people out of jail like crazy, right? All across the country, they're letting people out of jail because it's a public health. Having those jails there is a public health risk. Ramsey Orta, who filmed the killing of Eric Garner, who's been just viciously gone after by the NYPD and other forces, they hate him for doing that, right? He feels like his life is in a lot of danger. And, I've talked about this before, but it needs to be said, right? The prison system right now, right? I mean, you have people living in crammed conditions. You can't social distance, right? If one person in that prison gets it, pretty soon the whole prison's going to get it. And there are people that say, well, maybe they shouldn't have committed crimes. Well, that's all, if you want to have that attitude and think people, most of the people in jail haven't even been convicted of a crime. They're waiting trial, but regardless, right? Tudeh party in Iran. But regardless, there are prison guards. There are people who deliver food to prisons. And if you have prisons become just giant petri dishes for the coronavirus to spread, it doesn't stay in the prison. It's bad for the whole society. Right? It's a public health risk. Our prisons right now, we have such a huge number of people in prison. Millions of people across the United States are in prison. I believe it's like 2 million people, more than that, are locked up. And this is a danger to public health. Later in this coming week, I'm actually going to interview Reverend Billy Talon, who is, he's kind of a performance artist in New York City, but he was arrested protesting against one of these religious organizations that has set up tents in Central Park. But, he's an older guy. He's not young. And I'm going to ask him, I'm going to say, are you worried that you could have got coronavirus when you got arrested, for protesting, because it's going to a jail right now. I mean, your chances of getting it in a jail right now are pretty massive, it's not good. And that said, Bahrain is that's a US-backed autocratic regime. It's on the Arabian Peninsula, and it's a country, and the people of Bahrain are overwhelmingly Shia Muslims, but they have a Saudi-installed puppet government, a monarchy that is Sunni. And the people there protest for their rights, and they want their freedom, and they get locked up, and they get beheaded, and they get tortured. And it's just a brutal, repressive regime. And the way that the U.S. media demonizes the protests for human rights in Bahrain is it calls them, it says that they're Iranian agents. They're just Iranian. They're Iranian agents. But right now, there's a lot of political prisoners in Bahrain. People that were marching for their rights, people who were protesting, and they're locked up. And Human Rights Watch and all kinds of people have said these prisoners, these Bahraini human rights activists need to be released. They need to let them out of the jail. They need to open up the door and let them free. But they're not doing it. They're not letting them out. And it's unbelievable, right? All kinds of people across the United States are being let out of jail right now. A lot of people, if they're in jail for drugs or they're in jail for something, they're letting them out because it's a hazard. It is a public health hazard, these prisons that we've set up. And mass incarceration right now, it's a very, very dangerous thing. It's a very, very dangerous thing. So I just wanted to add that. Okay. What else are people asking me about? So I had a super chat about the Tudeh party in Iran. Well, okay, so here's the thing. At the time of the Iranian Revolution, the Tudeh party, they were like the Soviet-recognized communist party, right? I believe Tudeh means like People's or Popular Party, but it was the Communist Party. You also had something called the People's Fedayeen Guerrillas, and they were like waging guerrilla warfare, trying to do like a Che Guevara thing in the countryside. there was also a group called Mujahideen Khalq, which means People's Holy Warriors, and they were Islamo-Marxists, and they were this crazy apocalyptic cult, and they're all now like neocons, and they work with Israel to assassinate Iranian scientists. And after the Iranian Revolution, Iran was invaded by Iraq. Iraq was a Soviet-aligned country, so it was largely, I mean, the Soviet Union, from what I understand, was pretty much neutral in the Iraq-Iran war, tried to stop it from happening, but regardless, there was widespread feeling in Iran that the Soviet Union were aligned with Saddam Hussein, and because of that, there was a crackdown on communist groups in Iran, and then the Mujahideen Khalq, the MEK, the Islamo-Marxists, they went on a killing spree and murdered a lot of people, blew up the parliament. I know the current supreme leader of Iran, the reason that he can't move one of his arms is because had a press conference that was bombed by Mujahideen Khalq. So there was kind of a crackdown on leftist groups, and it was, I mean, there were a lot of activist groups in Iran of Marxist students. And there were a lot of Marxist students who supported Khomeini because Khomeini was anti-imperialist, because he was critical of capitalism. And so they were forced to operate under different names. I believe the student organization that seized the embassy, that did the embassy takeover, was called Students Taking Imam's Line. But a number of the students that participated, I believe, were Marxists or had been in the Communist Party or been in the Fedayeen or something like that. And that, it became clear when Iraq was invaded by Iran, or when Iran was invaded by Iraq, that Khomeini was going to be the leader of the revolution. But like in every revolution, you have a thermidor. You have a moment where there are some people where the revolution is over, and there are some people who say, well, it's not over, and they keep fighting, and it gets ugly. Many of the Tudeh Party members went into exile. Many of the Tudeh Party members have gone into exile, from what I understand. And it's divided. The Tudeh Party of Iran is very divided. There's a lot of Iranians in Germany. There's a lot of Iranians in Canada. There's a lot of Iranians in the United States. A lot of Iranians in Britain. There's a lot of Iranians in different countries around the world. Many of them used to be in the Tudeh Party, and there are many different factions calling themselves the Tudeh Party now. And that these Iranians, since the 1979 Islamic Revolution of Iran, they don't agree with each other. There are some Iranians who absolutely maintain that the Islamic Republic is their blood enemy. It is a reactionary regime, they say. It is their blood enemy. There are some Marxists who maintain that the Islamic Revolution is a progressive anti-imperialist government, right? And then they argue that Ahmadinejad, because he was very critical of capitalism, because Iran has a very strong relationship with the Bolivarian countries, and Iran, it has an economy that's centered around the government, and it provides services, and that it's complicated, right? And that there are many Iranians in exile who absolutely, Iranian communists who absolutely loathe the Iranian government. There are Iranian communists in exile who don't. There are people in Iran who study Marxism who have a very high opinion of the Iranian government and think it's progressive and anti-imperialist and anti-capitalist. There are also Iranian Marxists in Iran who don't feel that way, and are just so opposed to the Islamic, social system. It's complicated, right? So when you ask me about the Tudeh Party, back in the time of Mossadegh, there was a Tudeh Party. Even under the Shah, there was a Tudeh Party. Now there are many, many different parties. There's also Fedayeen groups, right? There's the People's Fedayeen Marxist-Leninist. There's the People's Fedayeen Maoist. There's People's Fedayeen. There's one that's called People's Fedayeen in Search of a Program. And, as Iranian communists fled Iran, they formed a lot of different factions, and they don't agree with each other. I will tell you, in Iran, there are a lot of anti-imperialists that operate within the Islamic system. There are a lot of Iranians that are in favor of socialism, that study Marx, that operate within the Islamic system. But there are also a lot who don't. It's complicated. I will also add this, that in Iran, there are a lot of hipster young people who are think they're anarchists, think they're Trotskyists, think they're Che Guevara fans, who are against the Iranian government, who are puppets of the West and don't know it, right? They don't like Islam. They don't like the Islamic system. They get on the internet and they read about the West, and they adopt a left aesthetic. But in essence, they are pro-imperialist. They think the United States is a land of milk and honey, where everyone, lives a life like New Jersey and all of that. And a lot of them are confused and join the protests that are sponsored by the U.S. government. And they're hipsters and they're young and they might read Marx or read Lenin or read Trotsky or wear Che Guevara shirts, but in essence, they admire Western capitalism. They want to foment chaos. They have a pessimistic worldview, and they just kind of like the aesthetics of the West. So that must be acknowledged as well. That there is kind of a current of young Iranian leftists who are puppets of imperialism, and I wouldn't put there's another but there's also a lot of young Iranians who study Marx and study Marxism that are part of the Islamic system, and function within it and view the Islamic Republic as anti-imperialist. So it's complicated. It's very, very complicated. I hope that answers the question, because it's not a simple thing. People want a simple answer to these questions. It's not that simple. It's never that simple. Oh boy, folks. How are folks doing? How are folks doing? I'm almost out of orange juice, but luckily I have plenty of water. I wanted to talk about, right now in the United States, we're facing an economic downturn. And things in the United States, people are unemployed. 1 in 5 people at this point has lost a job, from what I understand. Massive unemployment, like 20%, 30% unemployment. It's bad. And, people don't know about the 1930s. People don't know about what the Communist Party USA accomplished when they were strong and powerful. And there's actually a very, very good book, America Faces the Barricades by John Spivak. And this book is a treasure because this is journalism from a pro-communist journalist who traveled throughout the United States during the Great Depression. And he wrote this book arguing that the USA was headed toward a communist revolution. And he traveled throughout the country. And I actually was glancing through it. And I actually thought I would read to you. I thought I would read to you the first chapter, well, part of the first chapter of this book, because I feel like there are so many things in this book, the difference between Deng and Gorbachev's reforms, okay? Deng versus Gorbachev. I'll get to that after I read. And be careful with the super chats while I'm reading, because I'm going to be looking up and down, so they might go by. But I'm actually going to read to you from the first chapter of Spivak's America Faces the Barricades. This is written a long time ago. This book is published in 1935. But I'm going to read it to you because I feel like there's a lot of things here in this pro-communist thing about the Great Depression, this pro-communist work of journalism. There's a lot of things about it that might hit home with you. And this is called A Letter to the President. Dear Mr. President, I don't suppose you will ever see this, but I am writing to you to keep a promise I made to a 15-year-old Mexican girl. She wanted to write to you because she had heard that you were doing things for the poor workers. She didn't write because she didn't have 3 cents for a stamp, and because she never went to school to learn how to write. Her earliest memories are of wandering about in an old, rattling, wheezing Ford from vegetable field to fruit field, from fruit field to vegetable field, and you can't go to school if your father is always following the rich, productive earth and needs your labor in the fields as soon as you are 7 or 8 years old. I cannot give you her name because I told her I would write to you for her, and she became frightened and pleaded with me not to mention her name. She was afraid maybe you'd write the boss and her family would be denied the privilege of working in the fields all day for 35 cents. She said it was right to tell where she lived, and I'll tell you where you can find her. Just take the main highway from Fresno to Mendota, which is about 30 miles away, and turn west at Mendota for about 4 miles. You can't miss it because you'll see a big sign, a land of milk and honey. When you've passed this sign, you'll see against the horizon a cluster of houses. And when you come to the sign that says Hotchkiss Ranch, Cotton Pickers Wanted, Turn up the side road for a few hundred yards beyond the comfortable farmhouse with its barns and corn and cotton shelters. There's a row of 15 outhouses along the road. That's where the migratory workers and this little girl live, Mr. President. There are 2 more outhouses a little way from these, and those are the only ones actually used as outhouses. You can tell by the odor and the swarm of flies that hover around these 2 especially. This is a typical migrant workers' camp. Only some have 5 outhouses for the workers, and some have 30. It depends on the size of the farm. You'll recognize a migrant workers' camp because each outhouse home, they call it here, is made of plain wooden boards dried by years of tropical sun. The doors are wide open, and if you will see inside, you'll see that some of them have a board floor, but most of them do not. And some you'll find a rickety iron bedstead with a dirty old mattress and an equally dirty old blanket or 2, a box and a table and another chair, perhaps in some a pot and a kettle, or 2 over a wood-burning stove. The little girl in the 3rd house from the front as you approach. The little girl lives in the 3rd house from the front as you approach, and you can't miss it because there's a large sign tacked to the door that says scarlet fever. But don't worry about that, because the health authorities here are not worrying. They just tacked up the sign on this outhouse door and on that one near the end of the row, and they went away. They didn't tell anyone to be careful about a contagious disease, because that might have the camp quarantined, and the whole crop would be lost to the farmer, or for the cotton pickers and their children to be in that outhouse. I don't imagine it's very dangerous, though, for only 2 more children have caught it. If it had been dangerous, I'm sure the health authorities would have warned them. In this outhouse where a baby girl has scarlet fever, you'll find an iron bedstead. That's where the baby sleeps, the one that's tossing around in fever while the mother tries to shoo the flies away. The other 6 in the family sleep on the floor, huddled together. Father, mother, 2 grown brothers, a little brother, and a 15-year-old girl. They sleep, like most everybody else in the camp, on the floor. That barrel and rusty milk can in the corner of the room where everybody sleeps on the floor holds the water they bring from the Mendota to cool the child's fever. It is 4 miles to Mendota and 4 miles back, and 8 miles costs a little for gas, so they have very little to sparing with the water. That's why they all look so dirty. It's not because they don't like to wash. It's because it costs too much to get water, and water is needed for cooking and drinking. You can't waste water just washing yourself when it costs so much to get. After all, when you make 35 cents for a full day's work and spend some of that for gas to get water, it leaves you that much less for food. The mother isn't in the field today because the baby is pretty sick, and those children playing in and out of the houses marked with scarlet fever signs are too young to go out in the field, but everyone else is there. That's where I found the little girl for whom I am writing this letter. Perhaps I had better tell you exactly how I found her and what we talked about so you can understand just what she wants. It would be a big favor, she said. She would be very grateful. She doesn't mind picking cotton balls for 35 cents an hour all day, and she doesn't mind the filth, dirt, and starvation. But she is worried about the electric light in this shack. You noticed it, didn't you? The one with the dusty bulb right in the middle of the outhouse that they live in. Well, you have to pay 25 cents a week if you want to use that electric light, and 25 cents is a lot of money when you only get 35 cents a day, and you need 25 cents for food and for gas so that the car can go get water. It's not that she wants the light at night. She and her family got along without it. But you see, they've discovered that it's awfully hard to tend to a sick baby in the darkness. And it's always dark when the baby seems to cry the most. And in addition, this little girl is worried about herself. She is going to have a baby, And suppose it comes at night and there's no light. She's going to have a baby in this little outhouse where her mother and father and brothers live. This little outhouse with a sign that says scarlet fever over the door. When she wanted to ask you if she could possibly get in touch, what she wanted to ask you was she wanted to ask if you could possibly get in touch with somebody and have them not charge them 25 cents for the use of the electric light, especially when somebody's sick or expecting a baby. It's not so bad when you're well, but it's awfully hard when you have a little sick sister tossing and crying and you yourself are expecting a baby. I explained to this little girl that you would understand about her not being so moral. She is such a frail little thing working hard in the fields all day, and you know after you get through working, you just don't know what to do with yourself, and your youth just cries out to forget the days that have gone and the long years that stretch ahead of you. Well, you sort of forget that maybe it isn't quite moral to have a baby when you're only 15. I told the little girl that you had a daughter too, grown up, of course, and that she thought that if your girl hadn't gotten into trouble when she was 15, that you wouldn't have liked her to have a baby in a little wooden outhouse with another baby tossing in fever with no light to see anything by. I told her I didn't think you would either, and so sitting there in the cotton field in this land of milk and honey, she cried. But I started to tell you what we talked about, and here I've gone telling you what she wanted me to write. You see, when I walked out of the field, there was a little girl dragging a huge sack along the furrow and stuffing the brown balls into it. She looked so tired, so weary, and I noticed that she was with child. How old are you? I asked. She looked up and smiled pleasantly. 15. Working in the fields long? Uh-huh. How old were you when you started? She shrugged her shoulders. Dunno, maybe 8, maybe 9, I don't know. What do you make a day? She says, sometimes in the first picking $1.50. We get 70 cents, 100. I used to get 60 cents, but the red agitators got us 15 cents in a raise. But for the third picking, we only get 40 cents, 100, and there ain't so much to pick. You might be interested in her phrase, red agitators. That's what the communists are called by the newspapers. So now everyone calls communists red agitators. This little girl didn't know what a red agitator was. She knew only that red agitators got them a raise of 15 cents on the pound, on the 100 pounds by organizing them and calling on them to strike. 30,000 out of the 250,000 agricultural workers in California have taken out cards in a communist union. They call it Cannery and Agricultural Workers Union. And most of the 30,000 are from the 100,000 migrant workers who live in camps like this little girl. They don't pay dues often, but they carry their cards, and they are strong on organization and very militant, especially the Mexicans. You can probably read in the papers about the fruit and vegetable pickers' strikes in the Imperial Valley and around Sacramento and Alameda and San Joaquin Valley, right here in Tulare and Kern counties. There's been violence and killings, but the strikes were almost always won. That's because the workers felt a lot like this little girl. No matter what happened, it couldn't be worse than it was. If the communists would help them, then they would be communists. Sorry, it gets me a little bit emotional, but there you go. That's the situation we're in. So many people, desperate and suffering. Ugh. What's new, folks? What's new? How's folks doing? Right? We've got our task ahead of us. So I wanted to jump to this super chat. about Deng versus Gorbachev. So, what was the difference between Deng Xiaoping and Gorbachev? What was the difference? So Deng Xiaoping, he conducted market reforms. He set up free market zones. He built modeled cities. I don't want to pronounce the names wrong, but he built areas that brought in foreign investment, and facilitated foreign investment. But he never conceded any political power. That was the main difference. And the book, let me tell you the book I was just reading. I was reading Spivak's America at the Barricades. America Faces the Barricades. And it's published 1935. Great work of communist journalism. America Faces the Barricades. It's a great book, and it goes into what life was like during the Great Depression. It talks about the conditions around the country and the rise of the Communist Party and the unemployment councils and the organizations they built to fight for people's rights. It's just powerful stuff. It's a great book. I recommend it. And this is the kind of stuff we need to be reading. This is the kind of stuff we need to understand. So anyway, we were asked about Deng Xiaoping. And Deng Xiaoping, he versus Gorbachev. So Gorbachev, you'll have to remember, Gorbachev's program had 2 points to it. Glasnost and perestroika. So perestroika was some market reforms. It was like market reforms. It was privatizing some industries. It was some in foreign investment. Whereas Deng Xiaoping, I'm sorry. Okay, so perestroika was market reforms, right? Glasnost was political reform. It was allowing non-communists to run for office, putting non-communists into the government. And the thing about glasnost was that glasnost was portrayed as openness, right? It was we're going to allow a diversity of political views. We're going to allow a diversity of political views, right? But we're going to allow this diversity of political views, but it was really only an opening to the right. Within the rank and file of the Soviet Communist Party, there were many people who were more radical, who wanted to go back to Stalin, right? Who were more radical. There were left-wing dissidents. There were people who thought the Soviet leadership was too open, was not revolutionary enough, right? Those folks were not allowed into the political process. The rank and file of the Soviet Communist Party that was more radical than Gorbachev was not allowed, right? The pro-Stalin, they were not allowed. What they called the conservative opposition, people that were more pro-Stalin, they were not allowed. Gorbachev's openness was only an openness to the right. It was only an openness to anti-communists. It meant not only are we going to have the Communist Party in the Soviet government, we're going to have people who don't believe in Marxism and people that are more pro-Western in the Soviet government. That's what we're going to do. And so it was a political opening up. The Chinese Communist Party has never done that. The Chinese Communist Party has maintained political hegemony, right? They have not opened up to pro-Western people, right? So that's the first thing. The second thing was that perestroika, I believe, focused on privatizing major industries. Whereas, in China, the state-run industries largely stayed intact, but they just brought in foreign investment and had private sectors in addition to them. Whereas Gorbachev was kind of privatizing state-run industries, and I think that's the difference. But overall, there was a political crisis, you'll have to remember. 1989, 1990, 1991, there was a political crisis. There was, they refer to it as the coup, but it was Gorbachev was arrested by more hardline members of the Communist Party who thought he was out of control. And then there was, and eventually the Soviet Union fell, right? So it was very complicated. So, whereas the Chinese Communist Party has maintained political oversight. It has maintained political hegemony, right? They're not allowing other voices, number one. And number two, On top of that, the Chinese Communist Party is maintaining major industries, and the Chinese Communist Party is very united. At the time of the fall of the Soviet Union, it seemed pretty clear that the Communist Party of the Soviet Union was very divided. I mean, when you had that coup, what they call the coup against Gorbachev, the efforts against Gorbachev, it was very, very divided, and it was very divided. I don't feel like the Chinese Communist Party is divided. I'm sure there's differences within it, but it's not very divided. So, have you ever heard of a KGB defector called Golitsyn? He predicted the fall of the Berlin Wall 10 years prior and argued the USSR never actually went away. No, I have not heard of him. I haven't. I will say that that efforts by Brzezinski and Kosygin, yeah, I'm sorry, Kosygin? Why did I say that? I'm sorry. Efforts by Brzezinski to manipulate, like, I talked about those hipsters in Iran, right? Those younger Iranians who, they have leftist views, but they're very enamored with the West. They might wear a Che Guevara t-shirt, but they're confused, right? And that across the Soviet bloc, many people believed that the United States was the beautiful homeland of Beatles music, and it was Coca-Cola, and the West was just paradise. Yeah. So, yeah. I mean, they believed that the West was great, and they had leftist ideals, but they were kind of manipulated, and that was kind of the work of the intelligence agencies. Brzezinski figured out that the way to fight communists was not by straight up McCarthyist anti-communism, but it was by using like the Euro-communists, for example. Euro-communism was a big thing. It was a big trend in Western Europe, and that was because the United States and U.S. intelligence agencies started manipulating, like the Italian Communist Party, like the Spanish Communist Party, other communist groups. It started manipulating them, and and that was part of Brzezinski's strategy, was rather than having straight up anti-communism, let's manipulate left-wing circles. And you talk about the young people that were in the Soviet bloc that were kind of enamored with the West, that wanted freedom. They were like pro-Western in their own way, but they thought they were anti-capitalist, but anti-communist also. This was all a manipulation, and it was all going on. It was all an effort to manipulate them. It's all very complex. Yeah. But what else is on people's minds, folks? What else is new? What's going on? I got plenty to talk about. Right? We were talking about Malthusianism, talking about the Communist Party in the 1930s, talking about Marx, Biden. Why don't we talk about Biden? So, I rarely do this, but I tuned into a YouTube live that was going on another channel. It's a channel that people have recommended I do some collaboration on. And I tuned into it just to kind of listen to what they were saying and read the chats. This has been outstanding discussion. Thank you so much, Caleb. Sure. And I'm glad to do it. And thank you, Farshad. Yeah. But, I wanted to talk about Biden because the person on this live was just pushing this idea that Biden is, we have to vote for Biden, just grit your teeth and vote for Biden because Trump is a fascist. And you get a lot of talk like this on the left. I'm not ready. I'm not there. Okay? I'm just honest. I'm not there. I mean, there are things that the person said that were true, but there are things that the person said that are not true. And I mean, Trump is awful. Trump is mismanaging this crisis like you wouldn't believe. I mean, he's just completely mismanaging it. I mean, this is unbelievable. I mean, it's just unbelievable. Trump is incompetent. He doesn't know what he's doing. And he doesn't know what he's doing. He's mismanaging things. And Biden represents that more managerial bourgeoisie, that faction that is rich enough that they just kind of want to manage things from above. And that's who Trump represents. And because Trump represents that faction, Trump represents that lower level of the bourgeoisie. And Biden represents a more managerial section. And you could argue that maybe in a time like this, we need a more managerial bourgeoisie. I mean, that there could be an argument for that. I can see why people might feel that way. I don't buy the argument that Trump is a fascist, because if Trump is a fascist, he would have seized the moment and he would have gone full speed ahead and he would have taken dramatic, swift action. So I don't buy that, number one. Number two, I will say that there's a couple things in Biden's platform that I think are worse than Trump. One of the big things that stands out, if you look at Biden's letter to the Council on Foreign Relations, the article he wrote, America Must Lead Again, that was basically an endorsement by the U.S. Council on Foreign Relations. One of the things he really strongly emphasized was internet censorship, right? I mean, he really strongly emphasized the need for a crackdown on, quote unquote, misinformation. And he really called for Silicon Valley to tighten its grip. And what's weird is Donald Trump, his supporters are largely fighting against, at this point. They are fighting against, Silicon Valley. PragerU has had their videos demonetized. And Trump's base, right, the Trump supporting YouTube channels are constantly fighting against Silicon Valley, fighting against Facebook, fighting against Spotify. And in a way, I would say that creates a layer of protection for those of us who have dissonant views on the internet. Trump feels like Silicon Valley is trying to silence him. So the White House is going to push back against attempts to internet censorship because Trump feels like he's under attack. Biden, on the other hand, wants more censorship of the internet, right? Biden doesn't want these kind of conversations we're having on here every week to go on. He doesn't. He wants there to be more control over information by Silicon Valley, whereas Trump, because his supporters feel like they're under attack by Silicon Valley, because Trump's supporters feel like they've been pushed out, because they're somewhat critical of mainstream media, even though it's not the same as what we're talking about here, Trump's supporters are for more freedom of information on the internet, for example, right? So perhaps, perhaps on some level, we are protected. I don't know. I mean, that's a concern, right? I get the impression that Biden taking office could very well mean a big crackdown on alternative information and alternative media. And that's not just PragerU and conservative information, but it's going to be anything anti-imperialist. It's going to be anything critical of capitalism in a major way. That's a concern I have. Another concern is that the main criticism, the main thrust of that article, that if you read it, is that there's a feeling that Donald Trump is withdrawing the United States from the world, and that Donald Trump is allowing China and Russia to step up and lead. So in a way, it's subtly arguing that Donald Trump is more or less, that he's more in favor of multipolarity than Biden is. Now, I don't agree with that. But that's the impression you get if you read it. So there are things about Biden. There are things about Biden that are good, though. I mean, Biden wants to end the ICE raids and the crackdown on immigrants. I'm for that. Biden is more sensitive around the issue of mass incarceration. He certainly hasn't been his whole career. He was all about locking people up. He was a DLC centrist. He was, but at this point he's talking. He knows that's a really important issue with a lot of Democratic voters. He's more pro-labor than Trump, absolutely more pro-labor union than Trump. So it's complicated. It's very complicated. I get the impression that Biden is more concerned about pushing Russia and China off the global stage strategically. And Trump is more concerned about pleasing the Likud party in Israel, pleasing the Gusano lobby in Miami, pleasing the Shah and the Iranian exile community. Those folks are very important to Trump, by the way. The Shah supporters, those kind of people. the Southern California wealthy Iranian exiles, those people are very important to Donald Trump. So Trump wants to please specific constituencies, but it's very clear that Biden is committed to the long-term interests of American imperialism. He wants to push Russia and China off the stage. Trump doesn't care so much about that. He has his constituencies. So it's complicated. It's very complicated, folks. Trump, should the U.S. communist movement organize under the banner of socialism or communism or another label? Well, that's an interesting question. The thing is, it's weird now. Socialism has become almost cheap, right? It's almost not got any meaning anymore, right? I've heard people say the post office is socialism. I've heard people say Social Security is socialism. I've heard people say the police are socialism. I've heard people say that the socialism just means higher taxes, right? That socialism has become so vague and meaningless. Whereas communism, people think the Soviet Union, right? Or a violent revolution. And so it's like both of those terms have been more or less hijacked, I guess. Socialism has been reduced to just kind of welfare state liberalism. Communism, on the other hand, has taken on this connotation of wanting to restore the Soviet Union or wanting some kind of violent overthrow. And both of the terms, obviously the implication of both of them needs to change. I know, for example, I'm just passingly referencing this, but, at the time that the Trotskyites were trying to outdo the Communist Party and present themselves as more radical than the Communist Party, they called themselves socialists rather than communists. That doesn't make any sense. Everyone thinks that socialism is less radical than communism. But the reason for that was because the Communist Party had this reputation for being organizers for Roosevelt. So by saying, well, we're socialists, we're not communists, they were saying we're not part of a popular front, we're not part of a coalition. So it's complicated. Terms take on different connotations in different era, right? I think the stigma against socialism has been pretty much lifted with the Bernie movement and all of that. But, and here it's a big but the stigma has been lifted, but at the same time, the oomph behind the word, the actual meaning of the word, has also been lifted. It's been ignored. And so it's problematic. Now, communism, the stigma is still there, but also it's now associated with a lot of ultra-leftism. It's now associated with things that... So it's complicated, folks. That's all I can say about that. Ultimately, the movement that develops in the United States is going to be uniquely American. It's going to be uniquely American. It's going to be something unique to U.S. conditions. It's not going to be like anything in another country. It's going to be uniquely American. And it's going to be a unique winning formula for our time. And that's all it will ever be able to be. Nothing else is going to work. We're going to have to develop a unique winning formula for our time. That's all we can do. And, in the Arab world, they developed Ba'athist Arab socialism. In the Latin American countries, they developed Bolivarian socialism, right? And that there's going to have to be some kind of uniquely American development. It won't be socialism with Chinese characteristics. It won't be Deng Xiaoping theory. It won't be, Kim Jong-il, Juche. It's going to be a uniquely American development. It's going to be something specifically applied to our conditions. And that's all that's ever really going to work here. And will it have a completely new name? Will it call itself, American socialism? Will it call itself socialism with American characteristics? Will it call itself the American equality movement? It'll develop, right? We'll figure out what works. But the main thing is to push these ideas, push these ideologies. Someone jokingly referenced socialism with Appalachian characteristics. I think that's funny. I think there was a group out in West Virginia that called itself Students for Appalachian Socialism. And I know that some of the Maoist groups even raised separation for Appalachia at one point. They argued that Appalachia was an oppressed nation. And I thought that was kind of amusing. But I can go for a little while longer here. If anyone else has a super chat or a question, I'll address it. But I've been on here for a while. It's been almost 2 hours, so I'm going to wrap this up. Somebody asked me about the Japanese Communist Party. The Japanese Communist Party. Well, the Japanese Communist Party, it was coming out of the Second World War. There's a lot of amazing stuff that they did. They were underground during the Second World War, and they operated they got jobs in armaments factories and sabotaged the bombs and shells they were making. They did stuff. There's a novel called Crab Ship that was really a widely popular novel about workers who work on a crab ship that they catch crabs and they fishing boat basically. How they go on strike and it's really popular. It's like the Grapes of Wrath of Japan, and it's a communist novel. And the Japanese Communist Party is very large comparatively, compared to communist parties in other countries. I mean, compared to like the Communist Party USA, I mean, it's always been represented in the government. They always have a few seats. In the 70s and 80s, they became a Euro-communist party. And that's particularly problematic in relation to Japan because of Japan's relationship with Korea. Japan is the former colonizer of Korea. And for the Japanese Communist Party to have cut ties with North Korea, to be condemning North Korea, it's particularly problematic. There's a lot of Korean people in Japan who were brought to Japan as slaves, right? A number of the people who died in Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not Japanese, they were Korean. There's a lot of Korean people in Japan because of Japanese slavery and colonialism against Korea. So because of that, the fact that the Japanese Communist Party no longer is friendly to North Korea and is sometimes blatantly hostile to North Korea is very problematic. I once heard the story, in the late 80s, they had the World Festival of Youth and Students, the big communist youth gathering. They had it in North Korea. And the Japanese delegation, the Japanese Communist Party sent a delegation, but they got a huge standing ovation when they walked into the auditorium because they didn't bring their flag. They knew that to raise a Japanese flag in Korea would be deeply offensive. And so when they marched into the stadium in North Korea without the Japanese flag, there was just massive thunderous applause in support of them because they knew that a Japanese flag would be offensive on the Korean peninsula. And it was just a beautiful gesture that people recognized about how amazing and internationalist the Japanese communists were. One thing about Japanese communists that I also think is interesting is here in the United States, there's a lot of protesting against Hiroshima and Nagasaki, right? In New York City, every year on the anniversary, like Tibetan Buddhists and others have like a big ceremony. And there's a lot of commemoration and opposition to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japanese communists, I've talked to Japanese communists, always say, we never bring that up. Never. And I said, why? Because there are people in Japan who talk about Hiroshima and Nagasaki a lot, and those folks are admirers of Japanese fascism. And they're people that want to argue Japan was somehow in the right during the Second World War. And it's true, right? In Japan, there are a lot of militaristic, far-right kind of people. And they talk about Hiroshima and Nagasaki nonstop, and they downplay Japan's atrocities against the people of China, against the people of Korea, against the people of the Philippines, right? And that's very negative, and that's a big problem in Japan. Right-wing militarism in Japan, right? This kind of fascist military warrior culture, it's not dead. And there is a dangerous Japanese far right. And so Japanese communists generally tend to be a little bit cautious if they bring up Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Now, the Marxist interpretation of Hiroshima and Nagasaki that I've always understood is that as the war was ending, right, the USA did not want the Soviet Union to play any role in the liberation of Japan, and they didn't want the Soviet Union to play any further role in the liberation of the Korean Peninsula, especially. So they wanted to end the war immediately. And they also wanted to end the war proving that they had the atomic bomb, right? Because the atomic bomb, they wanted to show the Soviet Union that they had it. So Japan offered an unconditional surrender on the terms that they got to keep their emperor. And the United States declined to accept their unconditional surrender on the terms that they got to keep their emperor. It dropped the atomic bomb at Hiroshima, dropped the atomic bomb at Nagasaki, and then it accepted the exact same deal and let them keep their emperor And so it was militarily unnecessary, right? And it was to demonstrate to the Soviet Union that they had the atomic bomb. They did it not once, but twice to prove that it wasn't an accident the first time they did it. I kid you not. They were worried that the Soviet Union or other countries would say that the mass casualties in Hiroshima were accidental or something. So they did it twice, and they didn't need to do it, right? And it was an atrocious crime. And I don't think there's anything wrong with American communists talking about Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but I can understand why Japanese communists are very hesitant to talk about it. And I thank you for the super chat, folks. It's been a wild ride today. But if anyone has anything they want to conclude with, I saw someone saying that we should become red agitators, like I was reading about in the Spivak book. Thank you, Sander, for correcting my pronunciation. But yeah, this is a good book. I mean, there's a lot in here about fascism. And Spivak, one of the things that Spivak gets a lot of flack for pointing out, and I think this is fascinating. You know, Spivak was obviously an anti-fascism. This is exactly, Justin Simons, this is exactly what scientific socialism is about. Thank you for your contributions to an American socialism toward the goal of prosperity. Absolutely, absolutely, Justin. I know you're out there in California, and we're all getting through these times. But one thing about Spivak, and, you know, he has a reputation as this Marxist journalist, but one thing about Spivak that I find to be particularly fascinating is, title of the book again, America Faces the Barricades, John L. Spivak. One of the things about John L. Spivak is that, you know, he wrote a lot about fascism and Henry Ford and the American Legion and different groups that were, you know, pro-Hitler or fascist in the United States. And he got a huge amount of flack for the fact that he accused the American Jewish Committee of supporting the coup against Roosevelt. And actually, if you look at his Wikipedia page, it's basically, it makes him look like an anti-Semite. And he's accused of being anti-Semitic, but he himself was Jewish. And his main, I mean, he wrote a book like American Pogroms, you know, denouncing anti-Semitism in the United States. He was constantly exposing anti-Semitic and pro-fascist groups. But at the same time, he pointed out the complicity of certain wealthy American Jews in fascism. And that was like, that is a topic that got him a huge amount of flack. You know, and he argued that, I mean, read what he wrote. I'm not going to repeat what he wrote because if I say it, it'll come across the wrong way. But John Spivak, in addition to exposing anti-Semitism, was not afraid to expose, anti-communist factions within the Jewish community that were more, were more aligned with the World Zionist Organization, and actually thought that Hitler might be better because he would force, Jews to move to Israel, right? And I believe Hannah Arendt actually wrote about that as well, that a lot of the Zionists, Zionist sympathizers, thought that perhaps Hitler would be better for their cause. You talk about the Irgun organization, right? That was the revisionist current, the revisionist party, right? And how they were admirers of Hitler during the Second World War. Obviously Haganah, which was the Israeli Labor Party, they were anti-fascist and were aligned with the British during the Second World War. But Irgun, the revisionist party, you can find a lot of pro-Mussolini and pro-Hitler statements. And Spivak, in his journalism, it's in this book a little bit, but not much, but it's in a lot of his other work. He had no shame about pointing that out, and pointing out that certain wealthier sections of the Jewish community that were virulently anti-communist, that they had no problem, they almost had a sympathy for Hitler because they argued that Hitler was right, that Jews and Gentiles couldn't live together, and they wanted to use that to create the case for Israel. There's a lot written about this. It's very taboo. I know the former mayor of London, Ken Livingstone, got a huge amount of flack for pointing this out, but it's an unacknowledged fact. And obviously it wasn't universal, but this was within certain radical Zionist sections of the Jewish community who were very, 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 very opposed to Marxism, because Marxism, they argued, would get rid of any national identity for Jews. And this debate goes on. And that brings me to a point I wanted to bring up, because, I was hoping this would come up during my debate. I recently debated some fascists, but a lot of fascists bring up this lie that the Bolshevik Revolution was funded by Wall Street. I don't know if people have ever heard this before. It's very common. This is just bread and butter. And it's not just fascists who promote this. Like, there's a lot of conspiracy theorists who will promote this, and it's a widely held belief among conspiracy theorists and fascists and others that the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 was funded by Wall Street. And here's the thing, it's not true. And they take true things, and of course, this is a common tactic of liars, is they say widely unknown true things and make them out to mean things they don't actually mean. So there was a wealthy Wall Street banker by the name of Jacob Schiff, right? Jacob Schiff. And he was a very, very prominent Wall Street banker in the United States. And he was Jewish, and he did not like Russia because of Russian anti-Semitism, because of the pogroms, right? He felt that, and he was right, that there was a lot of mistreatment of Jews in Russia. So during the Japanese war against Russia, he got a medal, and he gave lots of money to Japan to fight against Russia. And it's proven that he funded something called Russian Freedom Group, RFG. That was not the Bolsheviks. The Russian Freedom Group was a group that supported the Constitutional Democratic Party in Russia. It's a group that wanted to turn Russia into a liberal democracy called Russian Freedom Group. Jacob Schiff funded them. Proves absolutely nothing. And in fact, Jacob Schiff was very anti-Bolshevik. And Jacob Schiff was part of the World Zionist Organization. He was not a member, but he was a funder of the World Zionist Organization. And one of the main activities of the World Zionist Organization after the Russian Revolution was trying to get Jewish people out of Russia, right? Because they argued that Russia was too dangerous, and trying to relocate Jewish people in Russia to Palestine, and to the British territory in Palestine. So Jacob Schiff and his politics did not support the Russian Revolution. He supported the Russian Freedom Group. Russian Freedom Group was anti-Bolshevik. And in fact, he died in like the early 20s. But the Jacob Schiff Center, and could you do a presentation on fascism and conspiracy theorists? I need to do that. I will do that. And I've done stuff on this because I research this stuff because it's important to have an answer. And I mean, the Jacob Schiff Center, that was the synagogue in the Bronx that was built by the estate of Jacob Schiff. And it was disbanded in the 1960s, but it was a major synagogue in New York City. It was one of the strongest anti-communist centers among Jewish people in New York City. In the 1920s and 30s, many Jewish Americans were sympathizers with the Communist Party. But the Jacob Schiff Center, which was this big synagogue in the Bronx, was one of the most anti-communist centers. So this idea that Jacob Schiff was a communist, which is like a central thing. I mean, these fascists believe this. No, Jacob Schiff, this Wall Street banker, funded the Russian Revolution. No, there were two revolutions in Russia in 1917. There was the Revolution of February, in which the Tsar was overthrown, which the United States also supported. The United States praised that move as a step toward democracy, right? The British supported it. The French supported it. Everybody supported the February Revolution because the Tsar was losing the war, and the Tsar was a national humiliation in a lot of ways. There'd been the Rasputin affair, where the Tsar's wife was having an affair with this priest who claimed he could do magic, and a lot of people wanted to get rid of the Tsar in February of 1917, right? The October Revolution is when the Bolsheviks took power, right? There was the July days, there was the Kornilov reaction. The Bolsheviks didn't take power. The Bolsheviks did not take power until October. And the October Revolution and the February Revolution were very different. And so when these anti-Semitic fascists try to say the Russian Revolution was funded by Wall Street, they're distorting things, right? They're completely distorting things. I mean, and what's hilarious, I'll add, is that nobody denies that Germany gave loads of support to the Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks didn't deny that. Lenin was able to get transport from exile to Russia because German intelligence helped him get there, because they knew he wanted to end the war. That's a fact. The sealed train to the Finland station, the way that Lenin got out of exile, he was living in exile, the way he got into Russia was because the German intelligence agencies, they put him on a sealed train, they gave him some money, we don't know how much, and they helped him get to Russia because they understood that Lenin was an anti-war activist and would end the war. So these people that want to say, oh, Wall Street funded the Russian Revolution, Berlin funded the Russian Revolution. No one denies that. Obviously, it didn't happen. It wasn't a conspiracy from Germany. But the Germans knew it was in their interest in World War I for Russia to withdraw from the war. So it's actually Berlin that funded the Russian Revolution. So it's obviously no surprise that a virulent, crazy anti-communist like Adolf Hitler would do everything he can to play up this idea the Russian Revolution was actually funded by Wall Street when it was his own country that had a lot more to do with supporting the Bolsheviks than the West does. And this lie, I will add, I've seen some versions of it that are downright disgusting, that are just downright ridiculous. You know, I mean, for example, I've had people claim that Trotsky was a Broadway actor. You know, he was just an actor that was hired by Jacob Schiff. That's a lie. Trotsky was a well-known Russian revolutionary. He'd been head of the Petrograd Soviet. Trotsky was living in New York City. He had a newspaper called Novy Mir that was in Russian language. So that's just a lie, right? And that you know that a lot of this stuff is very toxic. You know, yes, a lot of American capitalists wanted to bring down the czar, and yes, David, I will do a presentation on this kind of thing. I need to figure out what I want to include in it. You know, I think that this particular issue about Jacob Schiff is particularly interesting. But I want to talk about different things because, you know, I see a lot of these lies out there, and it's like these people that say coronavirus isn't real. I mean, it's like again, they've created that light switch effect where it's like you just blindly believe whatever they tell you to believe, or, you know, I guess you're in crazy land where anything goes. And that's the tragedy of our times, is that they have created that false dichotomy. You're in Alex Jones land, or you just believe whatever the media is saying. How's the new book going, says Adam M. It's going very well. It needs some more work. The bulk of it is written, but I need to go over it and fix some things. But yeah, someone says, what would Trotsky play on Broadway? The role of that insane guy with the crazy hair. Boom, zing. You know, I mean, I don't know. I like to joke about the fact that Trotsky wore leather pants, right? I bet you didn't know that. That Trotsky, during the Russian Civil War, it's widely alleged that Trotsky was this military genius and all of this. Trotsky was a performance artist during the Russian Civil War. They sent him from military base to military base to give fiery speeches and stir up the people. And they gave him this silly costume that they thought was like a super modern. And it was. Back then, it was probably like the coolest military costume they could come up with. But he had this like, you know, visor hat, and he actually wore leather pants. I kid you not, like a rock star or something. You know, so yeah, during the Russian Civil War, that's what Trotsky did. Is he was a very good speaker, and so he went around from military base to military base to military base in leather pants and a visor helmet, giving speeches and stirring people up. The story that they often tell is that when Trotsky would arrive at the military base, they would have all the deserters, and they would line them up like they were about to shoot them and be like, ready, aim, and then Trotsky would step in. No, we will not shoot our comrades. And then he would give his fiery speech, and it's like he saved their life, right? You know, I mean, it's just, you know, that's what Trotsky was. He was a flim-flam man. He was he was a good orator. He was a great intellectual, a great writer, great speaker. I mean, some of the Marxism, I mean, he knew Marx pretty well. My critique is that he was an ultra-leftist. He didn't understand when compromise was necessary, and he had a Eurocentrism. He was in love with the West. He believed that New York City, he wrote that New York City is the foundry where the fate of mankind will be forged. You know, and that he did not believe that the center of revolution would be in the developing world. He was never really comfortable breaking with Russian social democracy. You know, in his mind, that Marxism was just a more radical version of Russian social democracy. When Lenin had formed a party of a new type and said the revolutionary energy is coming from the third world, not the first world, Trotsky wasn't into that. I mean, and he never really broke with that. He considered himself to be the more radical wing of social democracy. That's my critique of Trotskyism. But, you know, I encourage people to study Trotsky, right? I mean, I learned a lot by reading Trotsky because Trotsky could critique the Comintern line because he was against it, right? Which you don't get that. If you read Soviet literature, it makes it sound like the Soviet Union had the exact same political line throughout its entire existence. Well, it didn't. The Soviet political line shifted. It zigged and zagged. Why? because the Soviet Union was trying to survive and build socialism in a hostile climate. And again, that's the problem with Trotsky. Why does he morally condemn the Soviet Union when he himself realizes the way the Soviet Union came into existence was a result of material conditions, that a bureaucracy was going to develop? It was necessary. They couldn't continue believing in permanent revolution, right? He moralizes, he declares that the Soviet Union is wrong, but he realizes that that's what, if the Soviet Union was going to survive, it was going to have to adopt these kinds of models. Now, someone says Leon Trotsky created neoconservatism. Well, not exactly. No, actually. Neoconservatism, a lot of people, so here's the thing, right? So Leon Trotsky, he left the Soviet Union. He was a professional anti-communist. He went around giving anti-communist speeches and writing for fascist newspapers and stuff. But he maintained the Soviet Union was what he called a degenerated workers' state. Whereas he said, okay, it still had a socialist economy, but it was led by a bad, non-revolutionary bureaucracy, right? So among Trotsky's followers, you had a current that developed led by Max Shachtman. James Burnham was another one. Who else? There was one guy, Martin Aburn. Those three, Shachtman, Aburn, and Burnham. And they said that the Soviet Union, because it had signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with Hitler in 1939, that the Soviet Union was no longer a degenerated workers' state, that it was state capitalist. And they cut ties with Trotsky. And those folks are the ones who became neocons. James Burnham became a neocon. Max Shachtman himself was always kind of a social democrat. But, for example, Irving Kristol, who was the follower was the founder of neoconservatism. Irving Kristol had been a follower of Max Shachtman, had been in the independent socialist clubs. And that neoconservatism emerged from the Shachtmanite, the third camp Trotskyists. And actually, one of the sources I'm using for my new book is a very good book on this called The New York Intellectuals. And it actually goes over this history of the Communist Party, the Trotskyite split, and the neocons kind of emerging out of that. But also, who was among the Shachtmanites was Irving Howe. Right? A lot of people talk about DSA, Democratic Socialists of America. Irving Howe. I'm not going to, Adam, I can't, I don't have an answer for that. And there's no way I can answer that and not say something rude or something. I don't have an opinion about that. Irving Howe, he was a prominent Trotskyist, became a Shachtmanite. And he started writing articles, was subsidized for the CIA. He wrote articles for Partisan Review. He wrote article, which was a CIA-funded magazine that was anti-communist. He was this big intellectual in New York City, and he was really known for being really, really anti-communist. Like, he would write articles for the New York Times denouncing protesters for being too pro-Vietnamese. He wrote articles, I kid you not, at the height of the anti-war movement, there'd be big protests against the Vietnam War. Irving Howe would write articles about, well, I don't support the Vietnam War, but these protesters are too soft on the Stalinists in Vietnam and the Stalinism. I mean, it was like, that's how, anti-communist Irving Howe was. Irving Howe was the founder of DSA, right? You look up Irving Howe, he was one of the most prominent intellectuals. Michael Harrington was the guy who did most of the work to build DSA, but one of the top intellectuals of DSA in its early years, and he led it up until his death. I mean, in the 90s, he was like the chairman of DSA, was Irving Howe. And Irving Howe was with that same current that the neocons came out of. He never became a neocon. Now, what's even more interesting is that, here you go, there was a faction around that current, right? So you had the Socialist Party, Michael Harrington, others. So there was the Democratic Socialist Organizing Committee. There was a current of neocons called Social Democrats USA, and they supported Ronald Reagan, right? They were like Trotskyists for Ronald Reagan or Social Democrats for Ronald Reagan. You can look that up. I mean, I don't know the specifics. This is not the milieu I hang out in. I know other people that came out of the Socialist Party, out of DSA, might know this a little bit better than I do. But this book that I've got, The New York Intellectuals, goes into detail about Irving Howe. And Irving Howe, he was a Trotskyist who became an anti-communist and started DSA. So not all of these Trotskyists became neocons. Some of them became liberals, Cold War liberals. Some of them became neocons. But it was a milieu of like kind of academic leftists in New York City. As the Cold War got going, they were very, very anti-communist, very, very anti-communist, and basically they, you know, they developed and they went their separate ways. And the CIA was heavily involved with them. There was a lot of CIA money that went to them, and their anti-communism was deemed as useful in the Cold War. And some of them became far right wingers, and some of them became whatever. And that's kind of the roots of neoconservatism. So I think that's fascinating. Yeah. Anything else, folks? Anything else? Dissent magazine. I think, yeah, that comes out of that milieu also. Dissent, right? Peter says Henry Ford was a Mason. That's interesting. I didn't realize Henry Ford was a Freemason. I feel like, didn't some of Henry Ford's publications during the 1930s, his anti-Semitic and fascist publications, didn't some of them like denounce Freemasonry? Could you talk about Cuban intervention in Angola? All right. Well, there was always a close relationship between the MPLA and Cuba. But yeah, apartheid South Africa invaded Angola after the 1975 rise to power of the MPLA, and Cuba sent troops to fight against apartheid South Africa. And actually, Cuba still maintains quite a bit of presence it still maintains quite a bit of presence in Cuba. There's a very close relationship between the MPLA and the Cuban government. A lot of Cuban doctors in Angola. In fact, they're escalating that presence right now. Oh boy, folks. What a day. What a world. What a world. I think we're probably going to wrap this up. We've been going for quite some time now. I think we're going to wrap this up. So, folks, I always end by saying we need a government of action to fight for working families. I almost don't need to say that now because it's so apparent, but we do need a government of action that will fight for working families. And on top of that, ever since World War II, U.S. imperialism and its followers have been continuously launching wars of aggression, but the people of various countries have been continuously waging revolutionary wars to defeat their aggression. While the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries might get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today. While the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today. Thanks.